Terry was walking past his parents' room when he heard his mother's frustrated exclamation. "I can't believe I have to work all Easter weekend," she bemoaned, sitting on the bed as she tried to stop her tears. His father was shaving in the bathroom and looked like he was only half listening. Terry thought she had probably gotten off easy, since now Dad was going to have to handle Easter by himself. He would have to color the eggs, make the Rice Krispie bunnies, hide the eggs, sneak out the baskets at night, and generally take care of Terry and his sister. His parents would have likely been a little sad to know that at 10, their son no longer believed in these things. Had, in fact, peeked while his mother set the baskets out last year. But he wasn't breathing a word of it to Laura, so she'd still be excited about the coming of the bunny. "The kids will be sad to not see you Sunday morning," his father commented, wincing as the razor nicked him. One look at Mom told Terry that was the wrong thing to have said. "Thanks, Randy, 'cause I don't feel bad enough as it is. I'm looking at working 16 to 15 hours a day for the next 3 days, and you throw something like that at me." His dad held toilet paper to the cut, but Terry thought the wound he had dealt his mother might be worse. I didn't mean anything by it," he corrected, finishing up with the shaving cream on the left side of his face. "It was just—" "Well, don't worry then," she said, getting up and turning for the door. "I'll just sleep in the guest room after I get done dragging myself in so I won't disturb you. I wouldn't want you to miss any sleep so you're fresh to deal with the kids all weekend." When his dad commented that wasn't fair, he set off a shouting match that lasted for the better part of 30 minutes. Terry had seen his parents fight before. Their arguments were something that were starting to become more frequent as of late, and Terry thought it might be because they never saw each other. His mother worked long hours at her job, and his father worked opposite her, making more money than she could from breaking her back, as she often said. They tried to hide these fights from him and Laura, but both had heard them and knew better than to get involved. So, when his mother slapped his father hard enough to rock his head to the side, it surprised her as much as it did Terry. She stood like a statue for a pregnant moment, the two of them caught in tableau, both too afraid to move lest their marriage just shatter like a soap bubble. I have to go to work," she stuttered, grabbing her coat from the bed as she walked to the door. Terry scuttled away, but he saw her shadow as she stopped in the door like she meant to say something else. She left instead, her slip-safe shoes making a crink noise on the floor as she walked. Terry just stood there, unsure of what to do now, afraid to move, lest she should hear him and turn around. But when the door closed in the living room, he knew she was gone. He still couldn't bring himself to move just yet, not sure what to make of this new development. He had heard them fight, but never liked this before. He peeked back through the door and saw his father looking at the mark in the mirror. He was trying to be stoic, but to Terry, it looked like he was having trouble figuring out what that slap had meant. Terry trotted down the hall while his dad was distracted, wanting to be in the living room with Laura when he finally came to check on them. She was watching Paw Patrol on the couch, but it didn't really look like she was paying attention. She glanced up when Terry sat next to her, and he could tell that she'd been listening. She was 4, but she already knew well to listen when her parents fought. It was how you could tell if Mom was going to come into the living room to play with you, or if she was going to sit in her room and cry. It was how you could tell if Dad might want to throw the ball around, or if he was likely to growl at you to go play somewhere else. "I'm tired of this," Terry said, turning to look at the TV as he watched the pups save a bunch of ducks. "Me too," Laura said, not even having to ask. "I don't want Mommy and Daddy to leave, but I hate when they fight. Sometimes I wish they would leave," Terry said, and Laura looked at him as she covered her mouth with her hands. "Don't say that, Terry. Who would take care of us?" "I don't know," he growled, feeling her sweaty hand slip into his, "but anyone would be better than them fighting all the time." They sat in silence for a while as the show went off and something else came on. Terry wasn't really paying attention to it anyway. He had learned early in life that when you were watching TV, nothing else really seemed important. You could ignore your parents fighting, your sister crying as your mom cried from the next room, your dad as he tried to talk softly to Grandma on the phone about how bad the last fight had been and how much he wondered how long they could go on. Dad wandered in somewhere between shows and told them that lunch would be in a little while, asked if they had picked up their toys beforehand. Both went about it mechanically, throwing their toys into the box as they tidied up. Terry thought a lot about that fight that day, and it followed him like a ghost as he tried his best to outrun it. He thought about the way that she had accused his dad of not wanting the kids as he put his toys away. He thought about the way Dad had accused Mom of only wanting to work all the time as he ate his PB&J. He thought about the sound of that slap as he tried to concentrate on a video game or a comic book, and they chased him like a dog chases its tail all day long. He was still thinking about it when he went to bed that night, and when Dad turned off the light and told him that he loved him, he found his eyes weren't nearly tired enough to send him off to dreamland. He lay there in the dark, letting it pool around him as the moon sent runners of light in through the window. He was still awake when his mom came home, and he heard her look in on his father before going to the guest room and closing herself off. Terry closed his eyes, trying to seal in the hot tears that threatened to come leaking out. 10 was too young to realize that your comfortable life might be coming to an end. He shouldn't have such thoughts, but he'd watched Bobby Fitzroy go through it the year before. Now Bobby lived with his dad in New Mexico half the year, and his mom down the street the other half. Terry saw him at school still, most of the time, but he looked angry and confused. Bobby looked like he wasn't sure where he was a lot of the time, and he'd started getting into fights more often. Terry didn't want that for him or Laura, and as he tried to stop the tears, he heard himself whisper the words of a prayer or a curse. Take them away. Take them away before they can hurt us. I don't care who's going to take care of us, but I don't want them to share us. Please, 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 don't make me choose between them. I just want the fighting to stop. He drifted off as a light rain began to fall outside, a soft sound beneath it that, to his ears, sounded like hopping. Laura woke him up in the morning, shaking him so violently that he thought someone was attacking him. Terry! Terry, wake up! Mom and Dad are gone! Terry came groggily awake, still half in the dream that had held him all night. He was sitting in bed, watching the light stream under his bedroom door, broken only by something that came thumping up and down the hallway. It seemed to shake the house with each loud thump, and the longer he watched, the more curious he became. He'd gotten out of bed, but each step towards the door seemed to stretch his room like a funhouse. The door was suddenly miles away, and as he moved closer, he watched that thumping creature move back and forth in front of it. Just as he finally reached the door, it stopped in front of it and seemed to stare at him, as much as a shadow could stare. Its long black shade fell across him, and as the door came open, he was blinded by the light on the other side. Just as something began to materialize, Laura had started shaking him, and he'd never seen what it was. What'd you say? He said, rubbing at his eyes, not sure if he had heard her correctly. Mom and Dad are gone. The room is empty, and I can't find them. She was still in her PJs, and her hair was a puffy cloud hanging around her head. She was crying, and Terry could tell that she'd been up for a little bit. He wasn't too worried, though. Mom and Dad sometimes left them alone, but they usually left a note or something to explain. The more awake he came, the more Terry just assumed they had forgotten to get Easter stuff and just went out to pick some up while they were asleep. Maybe, he dared to think, they had gone to talk about what had happened yesterday, too. Did they leave a note? They probably just went out to buy Easter stuff for us. I don't know. I woke up and there was a noise in the living room. I'm really scared, Terry. Someone put decorations up in the hall, and I could see something big moving around in the living room. Come with me to check. I don't want to go alone. Terry sighed and climbed out of bed. Laura got like this sometimes, and until he proved to her that there was no boogeyman waiting to snatch her up, she wouldn't leave him alone. Best thing to do was get up and prove to her that there was nothing to be afraid of, so he could go back to bed until his parents got home. They never went anywhere together. They never seemed to do anything together other than sleep. So if they were both gone, he still held out hope that maybe they were talking things out. When he stepped out into the hallway, however, Terry thought something else might be going on. The walls were covered in Easter decorations. Crepe paper yellow chicks, cotton ball bunnies, yellow suns, multicolored Easter eggs, they were all stuck up to every surface and seemed to glare down at him, even with the hallway lights off. The only light he could see, in fact, was the warm, welcoming glow of the living room. As they watched, something did seem to be moving around in there, and Terry felt cold dread with every step he took. The sound of it moving reminded him of his dream. It was like hearing an adult hop around on all fours, and it was not an altogether comforting sound. As they came into the living room, Terry saw the decorations were in here as well. They made the living room look strange. The furniture looked similar, just like a lot of his friends' living rooms looked similar to his. But the canary yellow walls had been completely covered in decorations. They covered the windows and the door in the technicolored vibrance of a Lisa Frank notebook, and on the TV stand, where the old 30-inch TV sat, were a pair of baskets and a note that looked like someone had written it in crayon across the virgin poster board. "Happy Easter, Laura and Terry. We have a wonderful Easter egg hunt for you. Find 5 Easter eggs and then come to the kitchen for a lovely Easter breakfast," it said. Terry was hesitant. If his parents had planned this, then it was way out of left field. Laura, however, was delighted. Her earlier fears vanished, and she laughed as she grabbed the pink and green basket that was clearly meant for her. Terry reached for his own, and as he looked around, he could see plastic eggs hiding everywhere. Hiding was a bit of a stretch, he supposed. Some were hidden, but others were just tossed about, helter-skelter, as if a much younger child might be seeking them. "Come on, Terry! We only need 5 eggs!" They had their eggs quickly, the living room fairly bursting with them, and as they came to the kitchen, Terry found the source of the glumping noise. Seated at the table, its painted eyes smiling placidly, was someone who could only be his father in a large and intricate rabbit suit. The legs were so comically big that you would have to hop in order to move, and the body was clothed in a vest of many pastel colors. A pair of large buck teeth graced the face, and one ear hung jauntily at a crooked angle. At the stove was someone in a much more normal-sized chicken suit, the dimensions more suited for moving. They were cooking and clucking happily, and Terry could smell pancakes and butter as he and his sister approached the rabbit man. Laura was hesitant, but her smile made Terry think that she was still enchanted by the whole thing. "Congratulations, my little peeps," the rabbit man said, throwing his arms wide in excitement. "You've passed the first test. I hope you're ready for some breakfast." As he said it, a group of smaller chicks came bustling out, holding plates up so their mother could put pancakes on them. They all seemed to balk and cluck like real chickens as they bustled about, and as Terry and his sister sat down, they brought them large pancakes with jelly beans baked into them, a glass of soda and chocolate milk to wash it down with as well. Both the kids set to covering their cakes in syrup and laid in with relish as they scarfed down the tasty treat. As they ate, the chicks left, but the chicken and the rabbit seemed to watch them with interest. Terry found it a little off-putting, but he supposed it was the idea of having someone in a costume that interested in you. He was still pretty sure that this was just his mom and dad putting on for them. Maybe this was some of their cousins that acted as the chicks, and he felt only a little embarrassed by all of it. Terry was a little too old for all this, at least he felt so, but he could appreciate the effort that had gone into it. Maybe this was their way of making up for all the fighting lately. If so, Terry wasn't about to ruin this for Laura, who was probably certain that this was the Easter Bunny and his helpers. "So," said the bunny, bringing his gloved hands together, "are you ready for the next egg hunt?" "Yeah," Laura said, practically vibrating with all the sugar. "It's very simple," the rabbit man said. "Go collect 10 eggs each and get a wonderful prize." Laura hooted and was off like a shot, but Terry stayed for a moment. "So what's the prize?" he asked. "Are you guys giving us our baskets early or something?" The bunny man cocked his head a little, and the chicken made a low little cluck sound as she folded her hands in front of her. "Why, you've already got your basket, silly. if you want your next surprise, you better go find those eggs before your sister gets them all." Terry rolled his eyes. "Whatever you say, Mr. Easter Bunny," and went off to find some eggs. The second egg hunt took next to no time as well, but Terry discovered something strange when he left the living room to search the few other rooms in the house. Their 2-bedroom, 1-bath was full of plastic eggs. The bathroom, his sister's room, his parents' room, the living room, the coat closet, even his room had some eggs in it. He found 5 in the hallway, 5 more in the bathroom, but it appeared that he had taken his time. His sister was already biting the head off a large chocolate bunny when he came back to the kitchen. The Easter Bunny was looking on with frozen joy, but the chicken was gone. Terry figured his mother had needed to go to work, and it would just be them and the father rabbit for a while. Terry brought his eggs back and was presented with a large chocolate rabbit of his own. He hardly needed the sugar, but he found that he was wrapped up in the spirit of the season now, so he took a bite. After that, the day progressed in much the same way. They ate candy, they hunted eggs, and when lunch rolled around, the chicken and her chicks served them a lunch which turned out to be some kind of hamburger made out of gummy bear material with circus peanut buns. They hunted eggs all afternoon, winning chocolates and stuffed animals and other little trinkets. As they sat on the couch watching the Easter bunnies coming to town, Laura snuggled against her older brother as she tried to stay awake. Terry was trying to concentrate on the TV, but he felt like something was watching him. The prickling hairs on the back of his neck were tingling, and as he glanced around, he saw something large lean back into the kitchen. Their dad hadn't broken character all day, Mom either, and though Terry applauded their efforts, he was ready for some normalcy. Surely they wouldn't keep this up all weekend, would they? His mom would have to go back to work. Dad would have to go back to work. This was fun. It was the first day in a long time that his parents hadn't spent the day fighting, but Terry knew that tomorrow it would probably go back to business as usual. As he drifted off, he felt the shadow of the rabbit fall over him again, and shuddered as he remembered the dream from the night before. He woke up in his bed the next day, Laura shaking him awake again. "Terry! Terry!" "What, Laura? I want to sleep. I'm tired." He rolled over, pulling the covers over him as he slid his head beneath the pillow. He felt something small and plastic press against his cheek, and opened his eyes to find a fluorescent orange egg nestled beneath the pillow. "Okay, but you'll miss the egg hunt for breakfast," she said shyly, running out of the room as he sat up in bed. He could already see a few of the eggs hidden in his room, and a smile stretched his face as he grabbed for his basket. It seemed they were having another day of egg hunts. Their father was waiting for them in the kitchen, Mom in her hen costume cooking at the stove, and when he held his hands out, Laura dumped 5 eggs into the floppy mittens that covered them. "Great job, dear," he said, pulling a giggling Laura into a hug. "Mother hen, Laura would like her breakfast now." The hen bacocked loudly and set a plate down in front of Laura with scrambled eggs and bacon. Laura looked a little disappointed before biting into them and finding they were gummy bacon and eggs. The rabbit looked at Terry as he came stumbling into the kitchen, wiping sleep from his eyes and taking in the strange scene. His sister was laughing as she stretched the bacon like taffy, scarfing it down with gusto. Terry started to sit, but the rabbit man opened his hands, flapping them a little as if he expected payment. "Right," Terry said. "How many is it this morning?" "Only 5, the rabbit said cheerily, and Terry put his head back in the living room and quickly snapped up 5 of the plastic eggs. After he handed them to his father, he was rewarded with his own plate of gummy breakfast. "Not to ruin your theme here, Dad, but could I get some real eggs?" He heard the pan crash against the stove and turned to see Mother Hen glowering at him through the eye holes of her mask. Even through those painted-on happy eyes, Terry felt like he could feel the coals of her rage. Was she that committed to the role? "My bad, Mom. I didn't mean to insult you," he said, turning to eat. The Easter Bunny was giving her an equally hollow look, but turned back to Terry with his frozen regard. "Eat up, kids. We have another fun day of egg hunts ahead. We might even dye some eggs and make some crafts. Won't that be fun?" "Yeah!" Laura cried, gobbling up the rest of her breakfast. Terry agreed. leaning in and wondering how long this was going to go. They sat on the couch again that night, watching something called The Easter Chick. They had made masks after breakfast, both of them looking like chick faces made out of Easter grass and papier-mâché. Laura had worn hers all day, looking like a clucking hen as she went about her Easter egg hunting. She punctuated each loud squawk with a giggle, and the Easter Bunny seemed to like her enthusiasm. Terry, on the other hand, was glad they would only really be able to do this for one more day. Tomorrow would be Sunday, and Terry expected that after tomorrow, things would go back to normal. The egg hunts were fun, but they had needed 30 eggs to get dinner. Terry had been afraid that they couldn't find 60 eggs between them, but they had managed it after he remembered the one under his pillow and found a few more in his room. They'd been hunting eggs all day, and the longer it went on, the less certain Terry was that his father was in that costume. He had felt the rabbit man watching him on multiple occasions, peeking from doorways and skulking in the shadows, and it just didn't seem like the kind of thing his dad would do. Except for at meals, the chicken woman and her chicks were nowhere to be seen, and Terry wondered where they were going. They had to be disappearing through the back door, because they certainly weren't going out the front. Terry glanced at the window, still covered in decorations, and began to doubt that there was anything there but more wall. There had always been a window there. He knew that, but he was doubtful that there was a window or a door in the living room anymore. The movie went off, and the living room was bathed in the murky credit screen. Terry could feel the rabbit man watching him, the shadows from the kitchen not quite deep enough to hide him completely. He had been watching them for hours, and Terry prayed internally that he was dreaming. This wasn't real. His mind was playing tricks on him. He was being silly. Of course it was his mom and dad. Who else would be doing this? He yawned, but he shook his head. He didn't want to fall asleep. Then he'd wake up in his bed, and things like this would go on forever and ever. No, it'd be over tomorrow. His dad would wake them up Monday morning and ask how they had liked having the Easter Bunny over all weekend. He would wear that big old grin he always wore when he asked what Santa had brought them, and Terry would know that it had been him the whole time. As he tried to make his mind believe this, he must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, it was morning again. Terry woke up the next morning, but not with Laura shaking him awake. He woke up to the sound of Laura's frantic footsteps as she ran around the house. Terry's stomach grumbled, letting him know that it was later than he had thought it was. When he rolled out of bed, his feet came down on a plastic egg, and he saw that there were more of them in the floor. He scooped a few of them up and headed for the kitchen. As he came into the hallway, his sister nearly knocked him over as she hunted for eggs. She was wearing the mask still, her giggling gone as she moved about frantically. She was counting to herself, clearly thinking of eggs, and Terry shook his head as he moved towards the kitchen. The Easter Bunny and Mother Hen were still there, and the bunny spread his arms wide as he trumpeted, "Happy Easter!" He was humming "Here Comes Peter Cottontail" as Terry put the 10 eggs into his arms. The rabbit froze, seeming to count them with his skin, before dropping them onto the floor when some of them broke open to let their jelly beans spill out. "Oh dear, someone didn't read the note. It's 30 eggs for your special Easter breakfast, kiddo." Terry gasped, though it was twinged with cynicism. "Come on, Dad, this has gone a little far. I'm hungry. I want food." The rabbit sat staring at him, his frozen face now seeming more sinister than jolly. "Sorry, kiddo. I'm the Easter Bunny, not your dad. If you want your breakfast, it's 30 Easter eggs. It's a good one, too. Don't you want it?" Enough. This was fun at first, but it's becoming too much. I'm too old for this stuff anyway. Laura may like this, but I just want some... But he had reached for the stuffed rabbit head, and the hand that grabbed him was strong and thick and painful. "Oh dear, pal. Looks like somebody wants to be a party pooper. No breakfast for you until you get your 30 eggs. Now scoot, kiddo." The voice never rose, never became mean or monstrous. But when he flung Terry out of the kitchen, Terry realized that the guy in the suit couldn't possibly be his dad. He tossed him effortlessly with one arm, and when Terry hit the wall outside the kitchen door, he saw stars. The rabbit man just sat there after he'd returned his arm to the arm of the chair, his placid face grinning like a specter at the fallen boy. Laura came bustling in then, the front of her Easter dress stuffed with eggs. She upturned her bucket, spilling eggs across the floor, and then dumped the front of her dress and let her bounty cascade into the Easter bunny's lap. There must have been 60 eggs there, maybe more, and as the rabbit clapped his hands together, he reached behind the chair and took out a box that Terry was pretty sure hadn't been there before. Laura reached for it, her hands shaking as she held up the intricately wrapped package, and Terry heard her squeal as she pulled out a pair of onesie pajamas that looked like a chicken's body, minus the head, of course. The shadow of the mother hen fell over him, and when she pushed the door closed, Terry was left hurting as he leaned against the wall. For a split second, Terry thought about looking for some eggs. His stomach was grumbling, and he wanted something to eat, but he knew it would be more sugar and candy. They'd eaten nothing but sweets for 2 days, and Terry's stomach wasn't just grumbling for lack of food. He'd felt ready to throw up after dinner last night. Swedish fish the size of a carp in some kind of sugar sauce, and his body was crying out for real food. Instead of looking for eggs, Terry decided to limp back to his room and see if there was any food there. After a half an hour of looking, he discovered that the beef jerky and the sunflower seeds and even the Christmas popcorn bucket that his grandmother had gotten for him were gone. That seemed to lend more credence to the idea that this wasn't his house. But how could it be anywhere else? Something bounced off his closed door hard enough to rattle it, and Terry had just enough time and energy to throw his body against it before something battered it like a cannonball. It bounced off the frame, Terry pushing continuously as whatever it was tried to get in. He yelled at it to go away, told it to stop, but it just kept pummeling his door until it finally dropped against the wood, panting heavily. Terry wanted to see what it was, wanted to know what was happening out there, but instead he locked the door and shoved his desk against it. A plastic egg fell out from behind the desk, and as it broke open, Terry saw the jelly beans glistening on the floor. He was just so hungry, just hungry enough that even the sugary beans looked tasty as he wolfed them down greedily. He laid eyes on another, and suddenly he could see the fluorescent colors everywhere in his small room. He wanted to gut them and devour every last morsel, but something told him not to. They might have to last him for a little while, he reminded himself, taking them and dumping them on the desk, trying to see what kind of resources he had available. Turned out, the beans lasted for 2 days. No new eggs appeared, and Terry ate the beans sparingly as he tried to devise some plan to get out of here. If the front door was gone, he would only know after he tore down some of the decorations. What would the Easter bunny and the mother hen do if he started doing that? Would they stop him? Would they hurt him? The bump on the back of his head proved that they would hurt him. But how much? And what was all this? Why was he here? How had he gotten here? Surely this hadn't been because of his stupid Easter wish. He worried about Laura, too. God only knew what was happening to her. He still heard her running up and down the halls as she searched for eggs. Sometimes he wondered if she was the one banging on his door. It happened a few more times, the banging less frantic than the first time, and sometimes he imagined that he heard some weird clucking as whatever it was battered the door. Mother hen, maybe? Terry didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. Whether the food ran out or not, he would need water. On the second day, he devised a plan to get to the bathroom and get back to his room. He would creep out after Laura went to sleep, something she seemed to do after a set amount of time. Whatever was going on out there, his sister still slept. and that would give him an opportunity to get water and maybe some food. He would check to see if the rabbit man slept too, and if he did, maybe he could sneak some food from the kitchen. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After he heard nothing from the house for what he judged to be about an hour, Terry shoved the desk out of his way and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the living room, as the TV showed nothing but snow. Whatever tonight's feature presentation had been, it was over now. Terry crept like a ghost from his bedroom and made his way down the hallway. His throat was dry, his belly grumbling, but he made himself be quiet. If the rabbit man or the chicken woman or even Laura caught him, it would be very bad for him. Each step felt like 1,000 miles, and each step made him expect to be devoured by a large and angry beast as his foot came down on the carpet. When his foot struck something, he jumped back in surprise, but when it groaned in pain, he looked down to see that he had stumbled over the last thing he expected to find. It was one of the peeps, but it was lying on the floor, curled into a ball. It was shaking and groaning, and as he came a little closer, it turned its head and said his name. It lifted its wing and tried to touch its face, but it seemed to panic when it touched its throat and didn't find what it expected. It shook its head, saying his name again as it sobbed in pain and fear, and that's when Terry understood. It was Laura. They had turned his sister into one of them somehow. Terry didn't remember crying, but when Laura lifted a wing up to his face, he saw tears on her feathers. He pulled her to him, wanting to comfort her to be sure, but he didn't know how. This was all his fault. He just wanted something better than his parents always fighting and his sister always scared. He just wanted a family that loved each other. When he picked her up, he found her surprisingly light. He took her to the living room, intending to discover if there was a door there or not. He laid her on the couch, Laura seeming to bask in the glow of the TV, as he went to work. The crate paper and construction paper came down in harsh gasps as Terry tore it. The walls were covered in them, thick as spider web, and as they came down, Terry felt almost hopeless, as only the walls greeted him. There was no door, no window, no escape from this place. Terry slammed his small fist against the wall in impotent rage. They had trapped him. The only way out was through the damned rabbit and his clucking wife. And Terry doubted that they could get past them, even if his sister was conscious. Even less so if he had to carry her. Lose something, kiddo? Terry spun in a blind panic, and there was the Easter Bunny. He looked different now, slightly smaller, and when he moved, Terry realized why. His legs moved like they should have, galumphing along like a rabbit's would. He was minus his vest, and his face was far too expressive for a normal creature. He looked like the costume he had worn, but he was just too real to be believed. He was like a prop in a movie. The most genuine thing Terry had ever seen. He held out his hand, and a delicate blue egg appeared. Even at 10, it was the most beautiful thing Terry had ever seen. It was Fabergé, looking painstakingly painted, and in the front was a little window. Inside the window, Terry could see a little house with little trees in the front yard. He didn't need a closer look to see that it was his house and guessed the egg's purpose. I was worried you had died in there, kiddo, and now you're trying to leave before the game's over. Not very sportsmanlike of you. Terry looked at the egg, wanting it more than anything in his entire life, but knowing he'd probably never have it. Let's play a game, then. You find one more egg, and you can go free. Find my special egg in 24 hours, and you can go. Fail, and you come with me. Terry took a step forward, wanting to simply snatch the egg, but as the rabbit closed his fist around it, Terry saw it was gone when he opened it again. "Where's that? Where would you take me?" Terry asked, not trusting the rabbit man for a second. "Same place I take all the kids who wish for something better. You head home with me, join the peeps, lay the eggs I leave for kids who've earned them, and serve me for all time." Terry wanted to deny him, wanted to yell some of the unique swears the older kids used at school, but he knew that this might be his only chance. He was screwed either way, so what did it really matter? "Deal," Terry said, and suddenly every light in the house came on, bathing the space in light. The Easter Bunny was gone, but Terry didn't need him anymore. It took him 2 hours to destroy the living room, but he found no egg. He ripped foam out of the couch, moving his sister to a pallet on the floor as he tore it to pieces. He smashed the TV. He tried to pull up the carpet before realizing the futility, and after 2 hours he had nothing to show for it but a torn fingernail and a dull throbbing in his hand. He went room to room, tearing everything to pieces as he looked for the egg. All the normal eggs were gone now, and Terry was glad that they weren't there to muddy the waters. He tore open his parents' mattress. He pulled the drawers out of their dresser. He ripped his sister's stuffed animals open. He tore his clothes from the closet and piled them on the floor. He smashed his fish tank and sifted through the rocks. He pulled everything out of both closets, but after hours of searching, he couldn't find it. He held back his tears with every room that passed, and as he looked into the bathroom, he knew it had to be here. He had left the rooms of the house in ruins, and this was the last place it could be. He tore every towel out of the towel closet, but no egg. He emptied the hamper, but no egg. He took the tank lid off the toilet, and when he found no egg, he broke it on the toilet, leaving it gushing water. Terry looked everywhere, but as it came to pass that there was still no egg, he fell to his knees and cried amidst the seeping water. He had failed. He couldn't find it. Now he and Laura would be trapped in the service of this Easter Bunny, made to lay eggs and serve his food forever. His hands bled, his knees hurt, and as he cried, the tears stung the cuts on his cheek. Terry had wanted to go home. He just wanted this all to end. And when someone enveloped him in a hug, he flinched hard enough to knock himself into the wet floor. He looked up to see Laura standing over him, tears streaming down her eyes as she watched her big brother fall to pieces. "I'm sorry, Laura. I'm sorry I can't save you. This is all my fault. I wished for this. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. But she put a wing against his mouth and shook her head. She reached out with her other, the wing still possessing some stubby fingers amidst the feathers, and held out the egg that he'd been searching for. Terry's jaw fell open. The bunny had hidden it in the one place he knew Terry would never look, with Laura. The knowledge made him feel small, but as he shook the egg, he heard something rattling inside of it. He tilted it so that the picture window was face down, and a large old-fashioned key fell into his palm. He took it back to the living room, looking at the blank wall again until he found what he was looking for, a keyhole in that perfectly flat wall. He put it in and twisted, the door opening onto the mirror of the living room he stood in, minus the utter ruin that Terry had created while on his last egg hunt. He reached back for Laura, but she took a step away and shook her head. "Come on," he said, not understanding. "We don't have to stay." Laura didn't seem capable of real speech, but she took her wings and tapped them on her chest, as if to emphasize that she couldn't go back like this. It doesn't matter. Mom and Dad will love you whatever you look like. Maybe you'll turn back if you come back. Come on, Laura, you've got to come back." Laura shook her strange head, still covered by the papier-mâché mask she had made. Terry wondered what she looked like beneath it, but having seen the peeps as they served them meals, he thought he might be able to guess. As she went back to the kitchen, He saw the mother hen put a protective arm around her, leading her into whatever lay beyond that room. She only looked back once, and Terry only waited until she was out of sight to step through the door. "I'll come back for you somehow," he whispered, before falling into his own living room and passing out from exhaustion and malnutrition. That was where his parents found him when they came home an hour later. They'd been searching for him for 4 days and had just come from a press conference where they begged the kidnappers to bring their children back. His mother had screamed when she'd found him lying there, and they had rushed him to the ER. He'd been unconscious for about a day, but when Terry came to, he had told them about what had happened. He could tell they didn't believe him, thinking he'd been drugged or was just traumatized, but the search continued for Laura for the next 2 years. Terry told them who had taken her, but no one seemed to think the actual Easter Bunny had kidnapped 2 kids and then just let one of them go. Time went on, and after a dozen or so therapists and psychologists told Terry that his mind had misremembered a tragic childhood event, he started to believe it himself. He tried his best to forget about Mother Hen, the Easter Bunny, and his poor lost sister, but his dreams brought him back to that weekend often. In the dreams, the Easter Bunny chased him through the house, a nightmarish maze of halls and corridors that only ended when the giant rabbit finally came down on top of him, crushing him flat. His wife became fairly used to her husband waking up crying in the night, but she tried her best to help him through it. Despite everyone assuring him that it had never happened, Terry kept the egg on his desk, a reminder of his lost sister. Terry was 32 the next time he thought about Laura. His daughters were opening their Easter baskets as Terry and Mary looked on with smiles. Terry had to bury a shudder as he watched them crack open plastic eggs, and he reminded himself that all that had been his mind trying to make a traumatic experience more palatable. Candace and Schuler were not he and Laura. They would never have to hunt eggs through a nightmare house as they slowly became chickens. That was a fantasy, and one that was over. Schuler looked confused for a moment, holding up a very white egg as she read something printed on it. "Daddy, who's Aunt Laura?" Terry's breath hung in his throat, but Candace cut off any answer that he might have given. "I got one too. I don't think I've ever met her." Terry came slowly towards them, reaching out to Schuler as he asked to see. Printed in black ink on the plastic egg, the insides full of Technicolor jelly beans that spilled out as he gripped it much too hard, was something that brought Terry to his knees. He spent the rest of Easter in the ER, after fainting over with the egg still in his hand, his girls all very worried about him. On the egg were the words, "Happy Easter from your Aunt Laura." "What do you mean there's no second season?" The man who sat across from me was tall, his tweed sweater looking dumpy in my very trendy office. He smiled warmly from his hunched position, though. If you didn't know who you were looking at, you might believe you saw a shoe salesman, or a store clerk, or something much less grand than he was. The man held none of the charms a writer usually possesses, and none of the pomp of a playwright or a screenwriter. He was a very plain man, with a rather mad little grin on his face. He was, however, Frederick Matz, and that led me to attempt courtesy. "Just as I said, there's no second season." He sat back with the casual grace of one who is not delivering a serious matter unto his boss. When Fred smiled, I began to see how strained it looked. That smile had always been warm, if not a little plain, but now it looked more than a little crazed. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his fingers were continuously sliding over his cheek. He kept glancing at the corner of my office, and I looked to see what was so interesting, but saw nothing. His manic eyes kept darting, but I wasn't sure what exactly he was seeing. His behavior, unfortunately, wasn't so uncommon. We'd been working hard on this show of ours, hadn't we? The last 6 months had been nothing but revisions and reshoots as the need for them grew. Fred had been cloistered for nearly 6 days as he worked on the new script, and just as it seemed we might be ready, he was trying to back out. Now he was talking about walking away. Fred was talking about this as though it were nothing. Fred wasn't talking about trivial matters here. This wasn't the end of some pointless TV drama, some asinine action series that could just be replaced with one of the other countless shows on TV today. He wasn't talking about ending a low-budget TV show that barely reached 1,000 households, and he certainly wasn't telling me to take news upstairs that would result in me getting a pat on the back and a promotion. Fred was talking about canceling Falsty Review, the single most popular children's TV show on our station. He was talking about ending my goddamn career. Fred had made a submission about 2 years ago during an open call, and though I hadn't seen much in it, it had focus tested very well. Falsty Review was a show about an old theater, Falsty Hall, which had been purchased by a troupe of actors who were played by puppets. There was Mr. Gus, the director and playwright, and his actors, Miles, Judy, Clark, and Siegfried, a lion puppet. They were joined by their orchestra, various animal puppets, and the Meister, who had a magic baton. The baton would throw music notes onto the screen and lead the children in sing-alongs throughout the show. These were usually classical pieces, pieces of significance to the performance, and the show taught kids about music, composers, instruments, and various lessons about friendship and sharing and whatnot. The hall also had a ghost that lived there, and sometimes helped the troupe get through challenging performances by taking up much-needed instruments or roles on stage. On the surface, the show seemed ordinary, and not particularly original. The children, however, loved it. They adored Mr. Gus, the big-nosed puppet with the brushed mustache, and his ability to get through any situation. They loved Judy and Clark, the twins who loved each other despite being at odds almost constantly. They liked Siegfried, and his obnoxious growl could be heard from the arms of 500,000 viewers on the street as they hugged their white lion dolls to their chest and made it roar in jubilation. They liked the animal orchestra, all of them in their little tuxes and tails, that played the music. Above all, though, they liked the ghost that haunted Falsty Hall. Ghosts are almost always scary or off-putting for kids, but this ghost was helpful and seemed to like the acting troupe because they took care of the theater. She often helped them stop the bank director, a weasel-faced character named Miser Marcus. Miser Marcus was almost universally hated by the children. He was always trying to foreclose on the old theater, and every episode seemed to contain some scheme that he concocted so he could tear down the theater and use the land for houses or parking lots or something. The episodes usually ended with Miser Marcus being thwarted and the troupe celebrating their successful show. In the year it had been on the air, they had shot 20 episodes. Viewership on those episodes had been through the roof almost at once. It saw viewership higher than some primetime programs for a show that aired during their children's programming slot, and the network had liked the numbers it brought in. They liked them so much, they had even started playing it at 4 as well, so they could reach a wider audience. The Falsty Review toy line had been one of the best-selling toys this Christmas season, and they had started branching out into other areas as well. They had clothing lines available at most any retailer, hygiene items as well, and children's dinnerware that seemed to be impossible to keep in stock. The Christmas special, Christmas at Falsty Hall, had premiered during prime time and had been seen by over 1 million people. They had beaten out established Christmas specials on 3 other networks, quite a feat for a show that had only been on the air for a year, and the heads loved having such a show in their lineup. Now, this little man was telling me that there would be no more show, as if that was his decision. I leaned across my desk, giving him a hard look as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Fred, you signed a contract for 30 episodes. Falsty Hall is only 20 episodes long as it stands. You owe us 10 more episodes, at the very least, to complete your contractual obligation. Fred kept grinning at me, but there was something in his face that didn't mesh with that smile. The smile didn't quite go all the way to his eyes, and his eyes looked worried. To hell with that. His eyes looked scared. My aunt had owned a horse when I was young, and I had seen one of them look just that way when a snake had blundered into its pen. Fred looked at me as though he was looking at his death, and it was either die or stomp it into the dust. Oh, I'm aware of my contractual obligation. Here. He slid a check across the desk to me, and I realized it was the advance we had given him on the first 25 episodes. I hadn't cashed it yet. I was going to wait until it was all done, but I can't do it anymore. I've changed my mind about the show. It has to stop. I could see the fear working in him, his eyes growing wide as they darted around the room. Was he high? What the hell was going on here? Is it another offer? Has Disney approached you? They may have Jim Henson Studios, Fred, but the puppeteers at Marco's Grotto are just as talented as... No. Well, I have had offers, but my contract is with you guys, and I intend to honor it. No, the show just has to stop now. If it goes on, I'm afraid of the consequences. I drew in a deep breath, cocking my head at Fred. Have you been threatened, Fred? He looked away, his eyes darting to the corner again. Not by anyone that you can save me from. I leaned across the desk again, fixing my face into something resembling understanding. I reached out to pat Fred's hand as he rested it on the desk. He threw them away and put them in his lap, but not before my own came away slick with sweat. He was perspiring buckets. His skin was clammy like a fish. I had worked with enough actors to know high when I saw it, and he was throwing up more red flags than a Super Bowl referee. Fred, are you okay? You seem very tense. Maybe there's a place we can take you for a little while. Some place where we can get you less tense. He seemed not to understand at first, but looked disgusted when it finally clicked home. I'm not on drugs. I don't need to clean out. It's the Muses, okay? The Muses want to lead the show in a direction that I'm not comfortable with. I lifted an eyebrow at him. The Muses? You mean the puppets? The Muses were strange, that was certain, but they were just puppets after all. There were 3 puppets referred to as the Muses collectively. Their design was strange, almost like a shadow person the size of the rest of the cast. In every episode, there was a part where Mr. Gus would sit at his desk and think about that day's theater piece. He would unroll a piece of dry brown paper, like a scroll, and take up his father's quill as he started to write. He would hover it over the paper, hunched over his desk, waiting for the Muses to inspire him. These 3 shadow creatures would scamper out onto the set, leaning close and seeming to whisper in his ear. Mr. Gus would and ah and make all the appropriate noises as he scribbled down the day's play or musical skit or piece of something or whatever was happening on that episode. The Muses would leave just as he shouted, "Eureka!" and brought that day's plot back to the actors and orchestra. Despite how much the audience loved the other puppets, the Muses had always focus tested poorly. Fred had insisted that they be part of the show, though. No Muse plushie sat on a kid's bed, though. Not unless it had been custom made. Kids did not like the Muses. They found the idea of a shadow person who whispered into your ear scary. I had received letters from parents about how their children would have nightmares about the little creatures. One in particular from a guy in Canada who told me that he needed to take a double dose of his anxiety medication after tuning in just as they scampered on stage. Some trauma in his childhood or something, but letter writers usually shared a little more than you wanted them to. We had been after Fred to get rid of them since the pilot, but he had remained firm that they stay. It seemed he might have changed his mind now, though. Yes, well, no, not really. See, the Muses are based on my own Muses. They came to me originally with the show's idea, and ever since, they've returned to help move it along. The part in the show where Mr. Gus sits down and they whisper in his ear is how they tell me the direction of the show. I kept my silence and let him continue. I had 2 theories going, but I wanted to let Fred finish before I decided which one I liked better. The first was that he was holding out on me for money. Fred knew that the show was doing very well, and he thought, he should have been paid more than he got. He wouldn't be the first, but we had a contract, and in showbiz, that's how things were done. The second theory, though, was a little less palatable. The second theory was that Fred had snapped, and hard. Well, lately, they want the show to go in a different direction. They want to add new characters, people I don't know, and when I try to refuse, they threaten to hurt me. New characters? The cast is pretty full, isn't it? We had a budget for 5 puppets, and we pretty well shot it and more with that animal band of yours. These new characters aren't puppets. I think they're real people. They want to add an actor to the group, like someone from TV, a comedian, a surgeon, a songwriter. I don't know who any of them are. They whisper to me about them, and I can't make them stop. It was almost horrific to watch Fred as he broke down. His face seemed to shift like there were bugs underneath it, and as he spoke, his fingers seemed like they wanted to pick at the skin around his face. Yeah, he definitely wasn't trying to haggle for more money. Fred was losing it quickly. Maybe this was salvageable. Maybe we could get Fred some help and put him back on track. We'd all been working long hours. I had done a few 12-hour days myself just last week, but Fred was clearly stressed, and it was affecting his judgment. Fred, let's be reasonable here. You're overworked, and it sounds like maybe not sleeping well. Why don't you take a couple of days off, clear your head, come back with a new... Fred nearly snarled at me, and he leaned forward so quickly that I pulled back, startled at the idea that he meant to bite me. There won't be any more. Don't you get it? I thought they wanted to help me. I thought they wanted to make my ideas into something great, but all they wanted was to use me. They want to use the show to get at kids. They want them hooked so they can take them and make them just like them. The muses want to make the kids like them? He buried his hands in his hair, and his face seemed to spasm between barely contained rage and a kind of crazed glee. Haven't you been listening? You have to cancel the show now. These new scripts, they aren't like the others. They're different. They want to reveal themselves to them. They want to make their play. But I won't be part of it. I won't have anything to do with people being turned into something like them. You can't put it on the air. You can't let them win. If this show goes on, the children will suffer. I had understood only one piece of information from all this rambling, and it gave me some small glimmer of hope. So you do have new scripts. He leaned away, now terrified of me, it seemed. His eyes darted to the corner again, and he seemed to realize that he had said too much. It seemed that Fred had been busy after all, while he was cloistered away in his study. It appeared he hadn't meant to drop that little factoid, but it had slipped out nonetheless. I shouldn't have... Forget I said anything. I need to go. He pulled himself up, looking around for the door as he tried to make his escape. You're under contract, Fred. If you have new scripts, they're under contract too. We'll need you to turn them in. They're our property, after all. Never, he said, looking around frantically. Never. You'll never get them. There will never be any more, he said, backing away as his eyes ping-ponged between the corners. I saw his eyes scooting around like a crazed animal, Fred looking for an exit, and when he found one, I got up and tried to stop him before he could make good on his threat. My office is on the 8th floor. All the offices up here have windows that are supposed to be shatterproof. They don't open. People in my line of work tend to bomb hard, and management didn't want anybody collecting their severance package from the sidewalk. I had a bird hit that window once, spilled coffee all over my keyboard in surprise when it did. It left a big red streak that I had to get after maintenance to clean for 3 days before a bucket truck came and cleaned it off finally. Fred proved, I guess, that the windows up here weren't so shatterproof. It was all very sad, a rising star who couldn't handle the expectation. I said as much at his funeral, bought a new suit just for the occasion. I stood behind the podium and told them how I had tried my best to talk him down, but he had made 2 things very clear that day in my office. and I meant to honor them to the last. He had told me that he couldn't take the pressure anymore, and that there was nothing I could do to stop him from killing himself. On that, he had been right. I could do something about the second, though. Fred had made it very clear that the show must go on, and with the last 5 scripts already on my desk, we would see that Fred's legacy lived on. It was the least we could do for our dearly departed Fred. Dr. Pamela Winters handed the fidgety little man a cup of tea as she sat across from him and committed his smallest details to memory. She'd met Tyler McDowell before, when he'd come to do a story on the clinic for the paper. He'd been a grinning little creature, his sarcastic tone letting her know how he felt about what she did here. He was skeptical, plain and simple, and when he made an appointment, an emergency appointment at that, Winter had been pleasantly surprised. Mr. McDowell was not the sort of man to suddenly believe in what they likely thought of as hokum. "So, Mr. McDowell, what brings you to my tacky den of charlatan ideas and pseudoscience?" she asked, smiling with deepest chagrin. "Oh, you read the article," he said nervously, blinking as the steam hit him in the face. "I've got it pinned up in my office somewhere. It was well written, despite its narrow opinion of me." He laughed, wincing as he took a sip and found the tea to be too hot. "So, what made you change your mind?" Tyler sat quietly, letting the steam waft up into his face as he collected his thoughts. Winter thought he looked like someone contemplating diving into that teacup and not coming up until the bubbles stopped. I saw something I need to forget. I thought it was something I needed to know, a mystery I needed to solve. But now I know that some secrets need to stay hidden." Winter smiled, taking a sip of her own tea as the winter cherry and ginseng wafted over her. "Tell me all about it, Mr. McDowell." Tyler had never been more terrified in his entire life. All he could think about was the man he'd been following for the past 3 weeks, and the repercussions of his little one-man spy operation. He knew it had been wrong, but he just couldn't help himself. Tyler had been curious since he was a kid. He collected insects in the area, geodes and fossils, read books about nature, and wanted to know so many things. His life's pursuit had been knowledge, but it appeared he had found something beyond even his curiosity. It had all started that morning in Ingalls. That was the first time that he'd seen the man. He'd been doing some grocery shopping, stocking up in case of a surprise snowstorm, the kind that sometimes blew in this time of year in North Georgia. Kashmir hadn't had a big dust-up like that in a few years, but the weather report said that it was supposed to be cold, and Tyler was taking no chances. Besides, he had some extra cash after the month the paper had been having. It wasn't every day that 6 kids went missing in Jeremiah, Georgia, and Tyler had been busy working on stories for the Kashmir Intrigue. It made him sound like a vulture, but the overtime he'd racked up in the service to the community was astonishing. He'd paid the next 6 months of his apartment on time, bought more games on the Steam winter sale than he'd ever play, and was now about to fill his pantry and enjoy a week's vacation from his supervisor. He swore under his breath as he dropped the cereal he'd been picking up, his gloves still slick from the rain, and as he bent to get it, someone else was already scooping it up and passing it to him. "Let me get that for you, buddy." Tyler had opened his mouth to thank the stranger, his crew cut looking straight enough to hold a level, but when he looked up, Tyler felt his stomach take a hard flip. The man was older, probably in his early 50s, and his crew cut was sprinkled with gray. He proved to be a head taller than Tyler, as he stood to his full height, and his chest looked broader than the little reporter's whole body. He was dressed normally enough, and would have looked fairly normal if it hadn't been for his perfect onyx eyes. He didn't mean that the man's irises were dark. He didn't mean his eyes possessed a dark color. Tyler meant the man's eyes were nothing but perfect black orbs, both of which were staring at him with confusion. Tyler shook it off, taking the cereal with a shaky hand and muttering "thank you" as he scuttled back to his cart and tried not to look back, lest he start to stare. When he peeked behind him, the man had left, but he still felt like he could see those eyes looking at him. Tyler checked around the corner and kept his head on a constant swivel as he tried to avoid seeing the dark-haired man again. But he couldn't seem to get him out of his head. Everywhere he looked, he could see those pitch-black eyes, somehow expressive despite their depth. Tyler got his groceries quickly, thankfully not running into the stranger again, until he got ready to leave. As he left the supermarket, he suddenly felt a crawling feeling on the back of his neck. He turned and saw the man looking at him from the end of an aisle, his beetle-black eyes focused on him intently. Tyler left the man behind, but he never quite let him lie. After that, he became aware of the man any time he saw him around town. He didn't believe he had ever seen him before, but now his eyes seemed to focus on him any time he found him. In the bank, at the post office, sipping coffee at the cafe on the corner. Tyler saw him everywhere he went. The man's black eyes also seemed to notice him, and Tyler often thought that he looked at him with interest when their paths crossed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the man was an outsider. Kashmir wasn't a big place. The whole town was home to maybe 5,000 people, the most anyone knew anyway. A man with black eyes would stand out, especially in a place like Kashmir, but Tyler had never seen him before. He started asking around to see if anyone knew him, but no one seemed to know what he was talking about. "If there's a guy in town with black eyes, I think I'd have noticed," his editor said when he called him. "You sure you're feeling all right, Ty? Not working too hard, are you?" It wasn't that he was the only one who could see him. He wasn't crazy. People had seen the older fellow with the crew cut, but they all agreed that his eyes had been a perfectly normal icy blue. "Maybe a little intense," Dale, the cashier at Ingalls, said, "but certainly not midnight black." Asking around, Tyler learned that the man's name was Gary Lodge. He was a retired military man, though no one seemed to know which war he had fought in. Old Ralph said he'd claimed to be from Vietnam, but Mark Kittrell had argued that it was the Gulf War. Randy Markey told them that they were both full of crap, and the man had said that he was a sergeant in the Iraq War. Tyler had had to get their attention before they could start yelling at each other. They'd been sitting on the porch of Pap's, a gas station that had been sitting on the edge of Kashmir since the end of the Great Depression. The three old gaffers looked as if they may have been sitting there 5 years before that, just waiting for the station to spring up around them. "Did he say what branch he belonged to?" Tyler asked, already guessing the answer. "Army," Ralph said confidently. "Navy, of course," Mark said simultaneously. "Marines, hoorah!" exclaimed Randy in chorus. They all took a second to look at each other before beginning their argument again. Tyler left before it became too heated. This was how it all began, his obsession with the man named Gary Lodge. It started out with questions. He asked people what they knew about the man, what he'd told them, what he had done before this, and reports varied wildly. Some said he had been a trucker before retiring to the mountains. Some said he was an ex-cop from Atlanta who wanted something a little quieter. Others said that he was ex-military and he was seeking solitude. He lived in the mountains near town, though no one seemed to know which one. All agreed that he drove an old green Jeep with a canvas covering the roof, and Tyler had seen it parked outside various establishments in town. Tyler spent the better part of 5 days asking people around him, but the more he discovered, the less he actually knew. A background check netted him nothing but a trip after his tail. He couldn't find a Gary Lodge that owned anything in the area. His Jeep was unregistered in the county, and no one named Gary Lodge had so much as a bank account, credit card, or a library card that tied him to Kashmir. He got nothing back when he tried to search for his service record. No work history, rental history, or credit history either. Either he was using an alias, or he was a ghost. And Tyler didn't believe in ghosts. These should have been red flags, signs to let it alone. But Tyler couldn't. You see, even when he slept, it seemed he couldn't escape Gary Lodge. Every night since that first meeting, Tyler had been plagued by the same dream. He was running through the woods, seeing the same pines and oaks that he'd climbed and sat beneath as a child, his eyes darting as something hunted him. He would catch a glimpse of those black eyes as he ran, his body twisting as it slid through the gaps in the trees like a shadow. He was hunting him, stalking him through the familiar woodlands, and no matter how far he ran, he was unable to escape the phantom who pursued him. It only got worse after he saw him in the alley 2 weeks after the first meeting. Tyler had been leaving the office, waving at Gerald the janitor as he made his way to his car. "Knocking off early, Mr. Duncan?" Tyler nodded. "Can't seem to focus today. I guess I'm just not in the mood to burn the midnight oil." Gerald laughed, but Tyler knew it was more than simple focus. He was feeling close to burnout, the dreams beginning to take a toll on him. When he woke up from the dreams, he felt exhausted, his mind having spun itself out. He wasn't sure how much longer he could do this and stay sane. He walked to his car, intending to climb in and try to get some undaunted sleep, but he changed his mind as the key slid into the door lock. At that moment, a soft electric sound could be heard from the nearby bar on the square. Tyler decided that instead of going home, he would go have a few drinks, and maybe fall asleep to some dream that didn't involve the black-eyed man. He left his car in the parking lot, figuring he could get an Uber home and then another to work the next day. He had gone about a block and a half up when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. He had passed an alley between a pharmacy and a convenience store and heard a scuffle from farther back. Tyler paused in the mouth of the alleyway and thought about pressing on. It was probably just a couple of drunks arguing, maybe a few homeless people squabbling over choice sleeping spots. And it had nothing to do with him. He could have just headed to the bar, got his beer, and headed home a little bit sloshed later that night. But his curious nature, something that had taken him far in his career of choice, drove him to go investigate. With every step he took into the dirty alley, he felt more and more sure that this was not something he wanted to investigate. It sounded less like a fight and more like something a little more intimate. He wanted to turn around, but if something less than consensual was going on, he felt it was his duty to inform the authorities about it. What he found was indeed less than consensual. In the small alley behind the convenience store, 2 people were scuffling as one of them tied the other one up. Tyler peeked around the edge, not entirely sure what he was looking at. It appeared to be 2 men, one of them vigorously declining being tied up, while the other one paid him no attention. It was hard to tell from the single light on the pole behind the convenience store, but something appeared to be wrong with the man who was being bound. It almost looked like his skin was bubbling, and part of him seemed to be lengthening and shortening at will. He was still wildly insisting that the man had the wrong guy. The fella needed to just let him go, but his captor paid him no attention. He was a beefy guy, wearing old camouflage pants and a gray jacket that looked ready for the rag bag. As he finished restraining him, he pushed him into a corner. The man wept as the other pulled out a large handgun and pointed it at him. That was when Tyler realized that this was more than just a little foreplay. The man told the weeper to shut up as he held the gun on him, and Tyler watched him cock his head as if he were listening for something. When he turned his head, the light hit him just right, and Tyler saw the neat crew cut and solid black eyes of the man who had haunted his dreams. The restrained man looked up at him, spitting blood from his lip as Gary Lodge seemed to wait for just the right moment to end him. All at once, though, the man began to shift, and his body began to grow. His head took on a distinctly dog-like cast, and his body elongated. The man with the crew cut seemed torn about whether or not to just go ahead and shoot him, or wait for whatever signal he was waiting for. Tyler could see the wolf man beginning to flex at his bonds, the ropes groaning angrily, and thought Gary's time might be about up. That was when the band, who had been preparing to start at the bar that Tyler should have been drinking at, struck up their first song, a loud honky-tonk number that would have probably covered the rapture. The man with the crew cut shot the other right between the eyes. The half-man died mid-transformation, his body stuck somewhere between as he bled onto the concrete. Gary looked around, his ears raised as he listened for alarms being sounded, as he slid the gun away. Tyler stood transfixed for a moment, trying to make sense of all of it. He had just watched the black-eyed man murder somebody. More than that, he had watched him murder someone who was not entirely human. As the man with the crew cut bent down to pick up his victim, Tyler realized that this would be his chance to run. As the band and the bar hit the high point of a boozy little number, he lit out towards the newspaper parking lot. His plan to get a little tipsy completely evaporated as he ran, nearly bumping into the old green Jeep that was parked beside the alley. He didn't stop running until he got to his car and sped out of the parking lot. The next time he saw Gary Lodge, he was reminded of that incident in the alleyway. The next time he saw the black-eyed man, he thought he was about to be on the receiving end of that single gunshot. It happened about 2 days after the incident in the alley. Tyler had been living those days in a constant state of fear. He'd been calling out of work and only leaving his apartment if it was absolutely necessary. On the second day, something absolutely necessary came up. His editor had needed him to come in and sign something that just couldn't wait. Tyler had tried to wiggle out from under it, but the man was insistent that it needed to go to payroll by Friday, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It turned out to be his expense report from the story he had done in Jeremiah. Tyler had signed them, insisting that he had to go after he was done, and went quickly to his vehicle. He'd been digging his keys out of his pocket, looking around fitfully, when the man with the crew cut came quickly from around the back of Tyler's car. Tyler felt his breath catch in his throat, certain he was about to be a squib in one of the town's newspapers. Beloved writer killed in senseless daylight shooting. Unlikely to be the headline, but one could hope. "Heard you been asking a lot of questions about me," the man said, and his voice was nowhere near as friendly as it had been the first time. He stood leaning against Tyler's SUV with all the cool carelessness of a hunting cat. "Asking questions is kind of my job," Tyler answered, stuttering over most of his words and sounding much less assured of himself than he had hoped. "I don't like it," said the man with the black eyes. "I don't like people asking questions about me. I hear any more people say you've been asking questions, or I get another ping that you've been looking for me online, and I'll come visit you again. Rest assured, that's one visit you don't want, little man." He didn't wait for Tyler to say anything. He just walked away, heading back up the street in the direction Tyler assumed he had come from. Tyler watched him go, still shaken by his words. He hadn't felt quite that scared since the football players had roughed him up in high school, and the feeling kindled something else in him. This guy was no different from those meatheads on the football team, the ones who had thrown his books on the floor and pushed him into lockers. He was a bully, and Tyler didn't have to put up with bullies anymore. He was an adult, and he could do something about the bullies now. He wanted to find out more, wanted to know everything. So, when he'd seen the green Jeep in traffic a few days later, he pulled in behind him without thinking about it. His guts were a mess of snakes, anxiously writhing over each other as he followed him out of Kashmir. He had no proof that he was going to his house. No one even knew where he lived. But as Tyler followed him, his gut told him the old Jeep was heading home. Guy must have seen him, had to have recognized him, but Tyler didn't care. Plus, if he asked, he could always tell him that he had business in this direction. This was the road that led to the interstate, after all, and the interstate was pretty much the only way to go in Georgia. He had followed him for about 20 minutes, sure he was going to discover nothing but an on-ramp, when Guy put his blinker on and turned down an access road that was all but invisible. Tyler watched him turn, rebelling against every instinct he had to turn in behind him, and proceeded instead towards the interstate. Once he was sure the Jeep was out of sight, he turned into a driveway at the edge of the interstate and wheeled back around. The couple on the porch lifted their hands to him, and Tyler lifted his in return. They were clearly used to being the city's turnabout, and as he left, he wondered if they would tell anyone they'd seen him. Once he considered that they might have no idea who he was, this thought made him feel nothing but like a paranoid mess, and he went back to the access road he'd seen the Jeep go down. He wanted to drive down the road, but Tyler knew that that would be a bad idea. Instead, he pulled off to the side, driving his car between the trees so it wouldn't be readily seen. He popped the trunk and took out a knapsack. Tyler had carried a bug-out bag for years. A lot of people did, and it had everything he might need to live in the woods for a few days. It was too much for what he had in mind, but it did have a few things he wanted. Binoculars, a flashlight, a hunting knife, some food in case he got lost. He slung it on before he could think too much about the plan and set off into the woods. He used the road as a guide, making his way through the woods as he kept the concrete serpent always on his right. He expected to see other roads, perhaps some other houses, but all that was here was more road. As he went, Tyler started to feel a sense of déjà vu. He had never been to these woods before, but the farther in he went, the more it began to feel like a waking dream. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the form of his stalker as he kept a close eye on him. It was like a dream all over again, and it sent a chill up his spine as he expected to run into his monster with every step. He'd been walking for about 45 minutes when he found the last thing he expected. He found a fence surrounding a collection of little buildings and a sign declaring this to be Site 9. One of the buildings was clearly a warehouse, long and tall with a slight mechanical hum coming from it. The other two were squat concrete boxes that looked like they might have been living quarters, and the Jeep was pulled up outside of one of these. Tyler dug his binoculars out and swept the grounds, looking for any sign of Guy, but he didn't have far to look. The closest concrete box was no more than 20 feet from the fence, and when Guy's voice preceded him by only a few seconds, Tyler nearly dropped the binoculars. "I think the townies are on to me," he said, and Tyler got as low as he could without making any noise. "There's a reporter sniffing around. I think he's marked me." He put his back to the concrete box and listened to whoever was talking on the phone. "I wouldn't be so worried, TJ, if it wasn't a damn reporter. Yeah, I know, my back trail's covered up, but it's still a little spooky. He asks a lot of questions, and I don't want him guessing anything about the black sites." He listened, nodding along, and Tyler realized he was talking about him. How angry would he be if he realized the subject of his worries was less than 30 feet away, listening to his conversation? He laughed suddenly, and Tyler tensed up to stop from jumping. "Loyalty? TJ, I could give a rat's ass if all these freak shows burn to the ground. If this guy finds out about the sites, there are 2 bullets that are going to fire, and only one of them is for him. I'm grateful you guys are helping me with my psychosis from the war, but I'm not about to find myself at Site 7 so I can eat a bullet for that." Tyler had started trying to walk backwards on his fingertips, slowly making his way away from the fence. He had learned all he needed to, all he thought he needed to at least, and now he simply wanted to disappear before Mr. McGregor happened to notice there was a rabbit in his garden. He came up short, however, when he realized he was caught on a branch. "Yeah, I'm still tracking the crypt. No, not a sniff in the last 2 weeks. She's old and wily, but I'll get her. This place is like a safari anyway. I don't know what it is about this state, but there's critters everywhere. Just last week I found an honest-to-God lycanthrope, I haven't seen one of those since Wales. I didn't even know there were real ones in America. Yeah, but they don't count. Those are mutts. This one was a pedigree werewolf. But he stopped and looked to the fence line. Tyler winced. He'd heard the snap too, as he tried to get his pack free. It had been loud enough to hear back at his car, he'd warrant. As Guy stared in his direction, he stayed absolutely still, those black eyes boring into the trees as he hunkered. Tyler wasn't religious. He'd been agnostic since he was 15, but he prayed now that this black-eyed devil would overlook him so he could get away. "I'll call you back, TJ." "Nah, not for long." He hung up the phone and disappeared into the concrete box, Tyler taking the opportunity to shimmy back as he unstuck and let out. He ran away from the fence, never looking back as he tried his best to get away from the monster he had startled. It was like his dream all over again, and Tyler expected to turn his head and see those black eyes tracking him. He thought he heard someone trailing him, dogging his heels, but when he made it back to the main road, he threw his backpack into the car and hopped behind the wheel. As he cranked the engine, he looked out to see Guy stalking the woods, a long rifle in hand. Tyler cranked the engine, watching Guy glance at the car, and threw it in reverse as he fled down the road. No hail of bullets followed him, no eruption of glass as his back window exploded. Just Guy as he stood in the road watching him go, a knowing smile stretching over his face. "What did you do then?" Winter asked, taking a sip of tea. His cup was nearly empty, and she could see his chest hitching a little, as if he had a throat full of phlegm. "I went home and prayed that he hadn't had time to read my license plate. It was a work car, thankfully, but I've been getting calls from them the past 3 days, letting me know he keeps showing up to ask questions about me. He found the car in the parking lot, and someone told him I was driving it. I think he knows that if I go missing, they'll connect him to the incident, but I don't know how much longer that's going to stop him. But how will you know to avoid him if you forget him?" "I don't know," Tyler said, his face resolved as he looked down at his tea, "but I can't live like this. I'm a coward, Miss Winter, but if I don't know I'm supposed to be afraid, maybe I can die with some dignity. For once in my life, I'd rather not face adversity with fear in my belly. Whether he kills me in my sleep or kills me on the street, I'd rather go out blissfully unaware. And who knows, maybe when he sees that I have no idea who he is or what he's doing, he'll leave me alone. It's worth a shot, right?" He gagged suddenly, and Winter watched as a thick round something fell wetly into his cup. He set it down, looking around in confusion, before locking eyes with Winter from across the table. "Dr. Winter?" he said, his smile seemingly embarrassed. What am I doing here?" Winter exhaled, setting her own cup down. "You came for a follow-up interview, something your editor wanted. I told you no, however, and when you got up to leave, you got lightheaded and sat down for a bit." "I did?" Tyler asked, looking sheepish as he rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a first for me. Oh, well, I must get back to the office now. Good luck in your—" He didn't seem to be able to come up with a word, so he just spun his hands at her office and left. Winter took his cup and put it in the cabinet. They were such odd creatures, these humans. They were capable of great bravery, though they often had to be tricked into it. Amidst his terror, Tyler Devereaux had found a splinter of courage. Winter hoped it would be enough to get him through what was likely to come next. She dumped the lumpy thing he had coughed up in a mason jar, where it bobbed and glowed slightly as she screwed the lid back on. It was a perfect sky blue when it pulsed, and that made Winter smile. She liked the blue ones. They were her favorite. A shot rang out from the sidewalk in front of her office, and she heard people cry out as they called for the police. "Someone come quick!" Winter heard a particularly shrill oldster yell. "This young man's been shot!" Winter sighed, possessed of great bravery and great stupidity. "Oh my God, there it is! Stop the car, Jacob!" Lily exclaimed as the house she saw in the ad came into view. Lily and Jacob had been in the same neighborhood for most of their 12-year marriage. They had liked the area when they moved in, but the peaceful neighborhood had seen its share of crime and decline lately. The straw that broke the camel's back and made them decide to move had been 3 nights ago when they'd been out to dinner. They'd been celebrating their 12-year anniversary when someone broke into their house and ransacked the place. Anything of value that wasn't locked in the safe was taken. When the police finally got there, they acted as though they couldn't care less. There was absolutely no help. So the next day, Lily went online to find a new house within their price range. Lo and behold, she found a lovely house a few neighborhoods over, on the nicer side of town. It was a closer commute to Jacob's work and was well within their price range. Lily wasted no time calling the number on the ad and setting up a walkthrough. They had set it up for that Saturday morning, but when Saturday arrived, Lily had gotten a short text telling her to go ahead and have a look at the place and sending her the code to the key box on the door. The owners said that they wouldn't be able to make it, but if they wanted to take a look, they could go right ahead, just to be sure to return the key when they were done and let them know what they thought. Jacob was very reluctant and wanted Lily to reschedule for a time when the owner could join them, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. She threatened to go herself, but that seemed to make up Jacob's mind, and he agreed to come with her. As they pulled into the driveway, Lily could hardly contain herself. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the porch, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The scent of gardenias filled her nose, the smell reminding her of summers she spent at her grandmother's house as a child. In fact, the front porch reminded her a little of her grandparents' house, too. The long porch stretched the whole front of the house, and it had several weather-worn rockers and a swing hanging from a pair of chains. Had her grandmother had a swing like that? Had Lily sat on it and swung when she was a little girl? Had she gone too high, perhaps? And Jacob leaned out the window, his hand over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's work. I gotta take this. I'll catch up with you as soon as I get done." Lily gave him a tart look and shrugged. She took one more deep breath before mounting the porch and approaching the front door. She had seen it on Zillow when she was looking for houses, and it had been one of the biggest reasons she wanted the place. It had 8 squares on the front. There was red, green, and green again, just like her grandparents' door. She could remember standing in front of the door as a little girl, feeling excited as she waited for it to open. Since her grandmother wasn't going to come to let her in this time, she put in the code and got the key to open the door. The door opened with a little creak, and Lily stepped inside with a broad grin. Jacob looked up at Lily as she walked into the house, thinking of how beautiful she looked as she walked past the threshold. He couldn't have known this, but it would be the last time he'd ever see her. As Lily stepped into the front hall of the house, she felt a bit of déjà vu. She felt like she was coming home, as if she'd been here 1,000 times before. On her right was a large archway that led into a sitting room. Lily decided to check out that room first, since it was the closest, and there was a window so she could look out and see if Jacob was coming in. As she walked into the room, she felt a strange change in the atmosphere, the whole thing beginning to shift. Lily walked to the window to call out to Jacob, but when she looked outside, his car was no longer in the driveway. Instead, there were several familiar-looking vehicles. Was that her parents' car from when she was 9? And that car looked like Aunt Judy's car. That truck parked on the street looked just like her grandparents'. But that was impossible. She'd watched her mom sell that car when she was 10. What was going on here? As she stood there confused, she heard a voice calling to her. Lily turned around, but she was no longer alone. Her family filled the couch and chairs. The room looked just like her grandma's sitting room from when she was a kid. She could remember seeing everyone seated like this once before, and the memory made her feel kind of crawly. As a child, they had often sat in her grandmother's sitting room during holidays or special occasions, but something was off today. Something wasn't quite how she remembered it. Everyone looked as though they had been crying. She didn't remember this scene from her childhood quite like this. Something was very wrong. As she abandoned her place next to the window, She walked as though in a haze to where her mother sat. She looked up as Lily approached and patted the couch next to her, motioning for her to sit. Her mother put an arm around her, not an altogether familiar feeling, and when Lily spoke, her voice was that of a very young child. "What's wrong, Mama?" Lily asked, looking around at everyone and seeing tears welling up in their eyes. Her father spoke first, though. "Lilybug, there's been an accident. Your grandmother fell down the basement stairs. She didn't make it." As those words left his mouth, everyone began to wail, and Lily felt her mother press her face against her head. Lily, however, sat speechless, trying to process what she'd heard. This wasn't how she remembered this. Was it? Lily got up from her spot on the couch and began to pace. Her memory of that day was fuzzy, but as she walked between the couch and the window, it began to solidify. She remembered her family telling her that her grandma had gone to live in Boca, not that she was dead. When Lily turned back to confront her mother, though, she found that she was alone in the sitting room again. The furniture, her family, everything was gone. The room was as it was when she walked through the front door, and Lily shuddered as a palpable chill ran through her. "Looks like a goose walked over your grave," she heard her grandmother say, and it was as if she were just in the next room. Lily rushed to the front door to get out of the house, wanting nothing so much as to smell the gardenias again, before she jumped into the car and told Jacob to drive away. She should have listened to him. She should have waited, but she'd been so eager to see this place. It had brought back so many memories, so many times that made her feel young again. But that was gone now. She didn't care how dangerous their neighborhood was. She would gladly live there for the rest of time if it meant that she could leave this mausoleum. The door, however, was gone. The entryway was still there, but the wall where the front door should be was a blank. She ran back to the sitting room window and started pounding on it, trying to get Jacob's attention. His car was back, and he was sitting in the front seat, but he didn't seem to hear her. "Jacob, please, help me!" she screamed, but Jacob didn't answer. He glanced up, but then looked back down to the phone, talking with Terry or Mark or whoever it was calling him from work. He couldn't see her. He didn't know she was stuck. And suddenly Lily realized she was alone. If she was going to get out of here, she'd have to do it herself. Lily thought she might as well look for another way out, and as if summoned, she noticed the hallway that ran opposite the sitting room. There would be a bathroom down there, if she remembered right, and some cold water on her face sounded exactly like what she needed. She headed to the bathroom, but as she got closer, she felt that strange shivering again. As she came closer, she could hear the sound of sloshing water, as if someone was splashing frantically in the bathtub. Lily stepped cautiously to the door that separated the hall from the small bathroom, and peeked in as the wooden barrier made a funny squeaking sound. She could see her father, knelt down at the side of the tub, and she could see him holding her mother's head under the water. Lily stepped back, the door opening to give her a terrible view of her mother's drowning. But it all seemed wrong. That wasn't how she remembered that horrible time when she was 12. Was it? Lily remembered her father trying to help her mother out of the tub when she'd had a seizure. She remembered him trying, but not being able to save her. This new reality of what really happened hurt her brain more than her heart, and Lily tore off in a mad scramble to be away from the awful sound of her mother drowning again and again. Lily ran to the staircase that lay beyond the foyer and darted up the steps without thinking of where she was going. As she ran into one of the bedrooms, her mind still reeling from the scene below, the feeling of déjà vu came yet again. As she turned to take in the room that she had just run into, she could see a crib with a mobile twirling overhead. The smiling yellow ducks spun drunkenly, but even their placidity couldn't bring joy to the scene. This was her son's room. "No," she pleaded, "not this memory." Her husband walked into the room, holding their 3-week-old son to his chest. It should have brought her joy to see him again, till she realized her wonderful husband was holding little Jonathan's face to his chest, muffling the sound of his cries. He didn't seem to notice her watching him, didn't seem to care at all that he was snuffing the life from what would be their only child. After the baby had stopped crying, Jacob quietly kissed him on his little cheek and placed him in his crib. But no, that's not how it had gone at all. Lily's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered Jacob holding their baby and comforting him till he fell asleep. When she had woken up and noticed that Jonathan hadn't woken up for his feeding yet, she went to his room and found him cold and blue in his crib. She screamed for her husband, and Jacob had rushed to her side to find her cradling their poor baby as if she could bring him back to life. They called 911, but when the EMTs arrived, they said it was too late. His death was stated as SIDS, and the two had been left to mourn their loss. Lily didn't know how much more she could take in this house. She slid down the wall, crying as the crib vanished, and the room once again was empty. Lily sat there for a few minutes, getting her bearings. Then she got up and slowly walked down the stairs. She didn't want to see any more, but she knew that she had to get out of this house if she intended to have any sanity left when she escaped. As Jacob sat in the front seat, talking to his boss, he realized that Lily hadn't come out of the house yet. It had been at least an hour since he'd told her he'd catch up with her, and she should have been able to see the whole place twice in an hour. He looked up at the window that overlooked the front yard, hoping to see her looking out at him, but no such luck. "Listen, Mark, we can handle the rest of this on Monday. I need to check on Lily. She's alone in the house we're both supposed to be looking at, and I'm getting a little worried about her." "Okay, that's fine. See you Monday. Bye." As Jacob climbed out of the car and walked towards the porch, he could smell a familiar smell. He stopped in the walkway and took a deep whiff, savoring the scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was bourbon and cigar smoke, and it reminded him of the Saturday night poker games at his dad's house. Dad's poker games had been full of both, and Jacob remembered peeking in as a kid so he could watch the festivities. As he got to the door and tried to open it to join his wife, the door was locked. He knocked, wondering why she had locked it behind herself if she wanted him to come take a look. "Lily, let me in, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took so long, but you know how much of a windbag Mark can be." But Lily didn't respond. He knocked a little louder, but still no response. At this point, Jacob began to worry that something had happened to her. He pounded on the door, his fears coming back at the thought of what could be happening to his wife. Hadn't he thought this sounded like a great way to get robbed or kidnapped? He didn't know this guy from Adam, and he had just let his wife go in alone. What had he been thinking? "Lily," he yelled as he beat on the door, but no answer came. Lily walked down the steps and into the basement as if in a trance. She was numb from the torture that this house had put her through, and just wanted to be outside in the sun again before it could show her anything else. As she descended the basement stairs, the air shifted again, and she steadied herself for what was next. She opened her eyes to see that she was in her own basement, but something was off. The shelves where she kept the Christmas ornaments were pushed away from the wall. As she walked over to see why it was pulled away, she saw a trap door under where the shelf usually was. The door was open, and Lily could hear something down there. Whatever it was crying out softly, as though too weak to scream. Jacob, worried and a little angry, decided to try to find another way in. He walked around to the back of the house, but as he came to the gate, he too felt that overpowering sense of déjà vu. When he got to the backyard, he saw a swing set that looked lonely in the open space. It looked like his own swing set from when he was a kid, and he walked curiously towards it. When he reached the swing, Jacob sat down and looked at the back door. He realized it was his childhood door, and scrunched up his eyes as he tried to make sense of it. He'd spent a lot of time on his swing while his dad talked with his mom. As he watched the window by the door, Jacob saw people inside talking loudly, their silhouettes performing sad little plays for this child's eyes to watch. But this isn't how he remembered this happening. It had been just another fight, his dad starting it like always. The mailman had been sitting at their kitchen table when he came home, a cold towel on his head as he drank a glass of his mom's lemonade. He had nearly collapsed on the front lawn in the heat, and though his father had smiled when he saw the man cooling off in his kitchen, Jacob had seen his mother flinch when he looked at her. His father had waited till after dinner to tell his son to go play out back while they talked, and his mother had seemed to beg him with her eyes not to leave. Jacob watched as his dad reached for something on the counter, and his mom's silhouette backed away slowly. His dad lunged with a sudden rage, and Jacob imagined he could hear the frying pan connect with the side of her head. His dad's dark afterimage stood over her for a few minutes, the pan coming down a few more times until sanity seemed to reassert itself. He stood up, the image realizing that it had talked a little too vigorously this time. Jacob could almost see the lack of confidence in the outline as it weighed its options. When it looked out at him, Jacob realized his father meant to make him an accomplice to his folly. "Jacob," his father yelled from the doorway, "get me a shovel from the shed. Then I need you to get in the truck and wait for me." Jacob hopped dutifully off the swing, with much smaller feet than his own. He was horrified at his blind fanaticism, but understood it all too well. As he ran to the shed to fetch the shovel, he realized that the memory of the night his mother left him wasn't the way he remembered it. Dad wasn't planning a garden to surprise her with, and Mom hadn't left them for a fella who ran the register at Ralph's. He did what he was told, though, and grabbed the shovel. He gave it to his dad and ran to the truck as his father began grunting at something that must have been very heavy in the kitchen. It couldn't have been his mother. Jacob's mom ate like a bird. Surely he wouldn't have strained so much to lift her. As soon as Jacob got in the truck, everything became hazy again. He realized he was back in his own car, his father's truck gone. As Jacob sat there, he began to cry. He didn't want to cry. He hadn't cried in so long, but found the tears just wouldn't stop. He was terrified of what had just happened. He was scared of a man he had buried 10 years ago. He was grieving for his mother in a way that he had never managed to when he was 8. Above all else, Jacob was worried about his wife. "Hello?" Lily whispered as she descended the stairs. "Who's down there? Do you need help?" She whispered, understanding the irony of her question a little too late. As she spoke, the whimpering stopped. It was dark and damp down here, the floor made of packed earth, and the smell of dirt and iron filled her nose. As she felt around for a light switch, she could hear something shifting across the room. Lily paused for a second, trying to listen to what it was. It was hard to hear over the sound of her heart beating in her ears, and Lily was afraid of getting snuck up on down here by the specters in the house again. She found a small chain hanging from a bulb in the ceiling. As she pulled it, the small light lit the room pathetically, but what she saw still terrified her. This was not any memory that she had ever had. She looked to where the sound was coming from and found herself staring back at her from a dirty mattress on the floor. She was battered and beaten, starved, with one hand attached to the wall by a metal cuff. Lily, in shock, started to back away, but heard someone walking into the basement. She quickly turned off the light and backed up against the wall, praying the darkness would hide her. As the steps got closer, Lily felt around for something to defend herself with, in case the person came downstairs. As she slid her hand across the cold dirt floor, she found what felt like a pipe, and picked it up as quickly as possible, holding it to her chest. A few moments later, she could hear heavy footsteps coming down the cellar stairs. She closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't be seen. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in front of the front door. Jacob got himself together and returned to the backyard to find a way in. The swing set was gone, as was the shed. The back door was no longer his childhood back door either. This door was white, with a blue ruffle at the top of the window, and the realization made him feel a little bit better. He pushed up the 3 steps to the door and turned the knob. The door opened easily, and as he walked over the threshold into the kitchen, he felt the shift again. He was in his dad's kitchen, and his father was talking to the police officer. "Mr. Daniels, do you know of anywhere your ex-wife would have gone?" the officer asked, tapping his pencil on an ancient-looking notebook. "No, officer. Like I've told you before, she called me 3 weeks ago asking to pick up our son because she needed a break from him. He can be a handful, so I agreed and went over to get my boy. She didn't tell me where she was going or when she'd come back. Jacob, go on to your room now and play. Let me and these officers finish our conversation." He had been 9 when the officers came to question his father. Jacob knew better than to disagree with the old man, but he knew that his mother had made no such request. At the time, it had seemed that maybe Daddy had been confused, but Jacob found out later that his mother had divorced him and left town with someone else. She had never tried to see Jacob again, and his father telling the police a lie had always seemed a little weird to him. One look at his father's flinty eyes, however, had told him to do as he was told, and Jacob ran for the staircase in the living room. He was walking towards the doorway when he looked back towards his father, only to find that everything was gone. The kitchen was empty now, save for him. Lily reached for the handle of the door, turning the knob with trepidation. Was this another trick? Some new game for the house to tease her with? She had never given up hope that she would get out, but she thought she might have believed the house would keep her here forever anyway. Would they even find her body, she wondered? Would they know it was her if they did? The door swung open, and Lily was again assaulted by the smell of gardenias. She came down the steps, running over the walk, and found the car exactly where she'd left it. She almost saw Jacob sitting there, the phone still pressed against his ear, but when she stuck her head into the window, she found the car was empty, the keys still hanging in the ignition. Lily wasn't sure what to make of this, and as she sat in the passenger seat, her mind started trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She realized her marriage, her whole life, was full of these little lies. Her mind made up memories to protect her from reality, but the house showed her the truth. She remembered what her father had done to her mother and what her husband did to their son, and she felt disgust well up inside her. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered, tears coming unbidden. That still didn't explain why she had seen herself down in that cellar in such a state. As Lily thought about it, she realized she needed answers. She climbed over the driver's side and turned the key. The engine came to life, and Lily peeled the tires as she headed home. She wouldn't feel safe in that house until she checked the basement to be sure of what was there. Jacob would be angry if he came back to find the car missing, and if such a place existed in her home, she would likely find herself in there if he made it home. Jacob called out to Lily, hoping to find her safe and sound as he made it to the stairs. He could hear someone upstairs, and he kept calling for his wife as he ascended. He could hear someone crying in the bedroom to the right of him, and he was afraid that she had gotten hurt, or worse, that someone had hurt her. "Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay?" he called out. He slowly opened the door and peeked in to see himself holding their son. His wife cried as she watched him smothering their son. The baby had been crying for hours, and Jacob couldn't handle that high-pitched squeal anymore. He snapped, and it was something he regretted every day. He had tried to move from beneath the shadow of his father, especially after what he'd done to Lily, but it seemed that you never quite forgot the old ways, or the old lessons. He reached for Lily as she lay there crying, but as his hands passed through her, she turned to dust beneath his fingers. Everything melted away like dandelion fluff, and suddenly, the room was empty. As he backed out of the room, he heard sobbing from the bedroom across the hall again. Jacob's hands shook as he reached for the knob, but he had to find Lily and make her understand how sorry he was for their son's death. He peeked inside as the door creaked open and could see his own bedroom. Lily was crying as she spoke to someone on the phone. She was talking about, oh God, she was talking about his little secret. She had found the root cellar, the shame he had hidden for years, and now she knew everything. He charged in, trying to stop her, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, it all just melted away. Jacob's father had often said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Jacob supposed he'd been right. Lily had taken a lot of convincing, a lot of mental conditioning, but Stockholm Syndrome was an interesting thing. She never remembered how she came to be in Jacob's basement after he took her from her work one evening. She never questioned how they'd been married for 12 years when he had only snatched her 7 years ago. She had accepted that there were no pictures of their wedding because of the fire that had burned their apartment. She had accepted that their son had died of SIDS too, though he thought maybe that one had been harder to swallow than the rest. In many ways, it was like her mind created answers for questions before they were asked. By the sound of it, she had been doing that for most of her childhood. Jacob's childhood had been fraught, but Lily's had been something from a pulp novel. She'd been happy to forget, happy to cloud her own mind with misty memories and rose-colored tint. But this damn house had probably shown her all sorts of things that pulled the wool from her eyes. As Jacob sat in the empty room, he wondered if prison would be worse than living in this warped memory for the rest of his life. The whispers from the house told him that he'd never get to know. There would be no open door waiting for someone like Jacob. The house had a new toy, a new rat in its cage, and Jacob would never bask in the sun again. Jarrett sat in his apartment, a drink close to hand, as he set up to make his last video. He kept glancing at the corner, the pocket of darkness seeming unaffected by the studio lights he had set up. He didn't dare let his eyes linger there for too long. He might see them, and then all would be lost. They had been after him for a while now, been after him ever since she had brought that darkness into his life. Jarrett tried to push that thought away. That was the lack of sleep and too much alcohol talking. He couldn't let her change him, couldn't let her win. It had been 6 months since his career had fallen apart. He had once been a big star, the darling of YouTube, well on his way to being one of the greatest musicians of his age. Then Crystal had appeared, and they had come with her. He still remembered the first time they had met. Crystal had been dating one of the actors on Saturday Night Live when Jarrett had been their musical talent and guest host. That had been while his star was still on the rise. That had been when he could still depend on getting 3 million views on any YouTube video he put up. He had quickly found her beside him in the green room, laughing at his jokes, flirting with him shamelessly. Jarrett was used to women flirting with him, but Crystal was different. All the girls before her had been hangers-on, girls content to ride his stardom. Crystal had dreams, aspirations, and after talking with her for a few hours, Jarrett had found himself smitten. She left with him that night, and within a week, she was sharing his bed. That was the first night he'd seen them. They had fallen into bed together, her drunk and laughing, and Jarrett buzzed and singing something he'd made up to make her laugh, when their lips had come together. They hadn't separated until they had fallen into an exhausted pile of sweaty bodies. She had fallen asleep, her body warm against his, and Jarrett had reached shakily to turn off the lamp by his bed. His head had been spinning a little, still drunk off the afterglow and the beer he had had earlier, when he glanced at the corner and pulled his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove. It had been there in the corner for just a second, a grinning dark thing with no eyes and a mouth full of far too human teeth. He swiped his face with his hand, trying to make his eyes focus, and when he looked back, the thing had been gone. Jarrett slept, but he slept with the lights on that night. Now he slept with the lights on most every night. "Hey there," he said, flipping his hair out of his face as he stared blearily into the camera. It's me. I've been thinking about this song for a while now, and I think I'm finally ready to play it." He picked up his guitar and played the first note. It sounded terrible. His guitar hadn't been tuned in a very long time. It didn't matter, he supposed. Anything he played would sound amazing. Although these days, it was all amazingly depressing. His upbeat and snappy songs that were once hummed by high school kids had become dark and brooding, fit only for the back rooms of clubs and the dimly lit bedrooms of emo kids. That had always been his power, though. He played what was inside him, and he played it well. If his songs were dark, then it was a reflection of him. The tune jangled like a dying thing, but Jared played on regardless. Their relationship had been rocky almost from the start. Crystal liked to drink, and Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get high. Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get drunk and high and start fights with Jarrett in public places, ensuring that her face would be on the cover of the next day's tabloids. This was the sort of fame she was after. A sloppy train wreck sort of fame that made you more infamous than famous. Jarrett had grown up in a small town with a good family, and this sort of thing was new to him. He had never so much as seen his father raise his voice to his mother, and the thought that his mother might strike his father was more alien than her slitting his throat while he slept. Jarrett was in a situation he didn't understand, but he made the best of it, as best as he could. After 6 months of this, Jarrett threatened to call it off with her, but this would prove to be a pattern with them. Crystal would cry and leave, saying Jarrett didn't need her around and how much better he'd be without her, and then Jarrett would miss her, blaming himself for their troubles. Then Crystal would send him a text a few days later, and they would fall back together like puzzle pieces. Then she would repeat it a few months later, and the cycle would continue, again and again. In hindsight, it was easy to see that he'd been in an abusive relationship, but it's harder to see things like that from the inside. It's hard to tell a lot of things, until you're staring at the end. As the fighting and the hurting went on, they just kept coming back. He would see them out of the corner of his eye. He would see them in the dark corners of his house. He would see them standing on the street corner as his cab drove between clubs and venues. They followed him. They wanted him. But for some reason, they didn't like to hang around while he played music. His music was upbeat, hopeful, and the little monsters didn't seem to like the sound of it. He never saw them in the places where he performed, and it was the only respite from their leering mouths that he found. As his song jangled on, though, he could see them now. They gathered in the corners of his dingy apartment. They grinned at him from the shadows of his kitchenette. As the song went on, his acoustic guitar sounded like a dying animal as he sang in a husky, whiskey-soaked voice. He saw them coming closer as he baked under the single stage light. He was tired of running. He was ready for them to catch him. She had claimed that she left him, but it had been Jarrett who finally ended it. He'd had enough of the fighting, he'd had enough of the apologies, and he'd had enough of her adding controversy to what was otherwise a drama-free life. She had come to start a fight with him, the tabloids having moved on from her last public explosion, and he put her out. He said it was over, he said they were through, and he said she needed to leave. The police had ended up being called to remove her, but she wasn't done by a long shot. His song came to a close, his guitar sounding almost glad to be done as it rattled to silence. "Thanks for listening," Jarrett said, wiping his eyes as he became aware that he'd been crying as he played. "If you're still watching, I'd like to let you know that this will be my last song. I want to thank all my fans, everyone who supported me through the years and through all the pain, but this will be it for me. Whatever spark I had is gone, and the music is just another reminder of what I've lost. Thanks for listening, and have a great life." He reached up and turned off the camera, the world not needing to witness the things that swarmed around him. His last thoughts were of Crystal, and those thoughts were filled with a blistering rage. Crystal had not gone quietly. She had come back with accusations of abuse. Jarrett had been abusive. Jarrett had been physically violent with her. She had pictures and bruises, and at the end of the day, people had believed her. Well, not believed her, but everyone loves a train wreck, don't they? The more he fought against the accusations, the more guilty it was decided that he looked. Though cleared in the court of law, he was tarnished in the court of public opinion. Crystal would go on to publish a book about her experience, write and sing her own music, and take a tour of talk shows as she told her story. Jarrett climbed into the bottle, and when he'd come out, the creatures had been his only friends. Maybe you can help me with something before I go, he said, and the little buggers stopped in their tracks. Jarrett looked at them through the swoop of his long hair, surprised. He had never talked to them before. He had never even tried to reason with them. They had hounded him for years, but maybe all he had needed to do was acknowledge them. They were now the closest thing he had to companionship. When in hell, maybe you just had to enjoy the heat. I don't know what your plans are for me, but I'd like to take one more person along for the ride if I can. Think you can help me with that? As they whispered in his ear, his lips splitting into a ghoulish grin, Jarrett found that they could help him. Jarrett found, in fact, that they were happy to help him. He dialed Crystal's number as a new song popped into his head. He laughed a mad laugh that sounded like tittering from an insane asylum. As the voicemail picked up, Jarrett left his last message to the world. He tried to hold in his laughs, the sound already becoming less than human, but it was hard. He could feel the cold metal biting into his palm, but he didn't think they had realized it was there yet. Maybe they didn't care either. Perhaps his death would be enough for them. One more light extinguished from the world. Jarrett sang his dirge as he rocked on the edge of the bathtub, the water a gentle chorus behind him. It was the best performance he'd ever given, the best one in years, and when it was over, he hung the phone up and let it slip from his hand. It fell into the water with a metallic snark as it died at the bottom. They stepped towards him, now a large crowd of barely contained darkness, but he smiled back at them in triumph. "Sorry, kids. Not today," he said. He whipped the razor across his arm, cutting deep as he tumbled into the bath. He heard the lead creature scream in angry humor, and suddenly the swarm was upon him. He fell into the tub, his vision obscured by the red and wavery translucence, as a tide of black pushed him down to join his cell phone. They swarmed around him, chuckling in a watery way as the liquid filled his lungs. They might end his life, but they wouldn't have him. On a baser level, he knew they meant to add him to their ranks of shadowy, smiling devils, and Jarrett wouldn't have it. He may not have been allowed to live on his own terms, but he would damn sure die on them. He died, surrounded by the laughter one hears in hell. I sighed as I took in the destruction in the shed. It had been like this all week, and I was getting a little tired of it. Something had been breaking into our sheds and chicken pens, and I was at a loss to determine what it was. It was big, but it was also smart, and neither doors nor windows seemed to bother it much. It ate meat, as the 4 new chickens we had bought could attest, and grain, as our ripped-open sacks of fish feed and chicken feed could attest. I had wondered if it might be a young bear cub, but Grandpa thought it might be a fox, given its craftiness. "Any luck, boy?" he asked, stumbling up beside me with a leathery smile. "Nothing yet. I tell you, Gramps, this thing is tricky." When I had replaced the twist of metal in the chicken coop with a hook lock, it had gotten around it. When I replaced the hook lock with a crossbar on the shed, it had gotten around that too, coming in through a window. Whatever this thing was, it was smarter than your average possum, and I was beginning to wonder what exactly I was dealing with. "Maybe it's the little people," Grandpa said, smiling as he said it. "What, like the fairies you throw bottles for?" "Not quite. More like the ones I met in Alaska. They could just walk in and out of places, and they were wicked smart, too." I opened the door on the varmint trap and wrinkled my nose as I pulled out the bait that Lenny had given me at the trading post. It smelled like old cheese and bad blood, but he said it would attract all kinds of things. Most scavengers couldn't resist it, and even some of the larger predators would find it tasty. I made sure to sprinkle some corn around it, and even set some of the mutilated chicken carcass in there as well, just for good measure. "Sounds like quite a tale. Want to tell me about it?" It was coming on dark now, the sunset making the sky glow a deep red, and Grandpa nodded as he set off for the house. As the darkness fell, we sat around the kitchen table, drinking cold beers as Grandpa reminisced. It all started with a briefing from the base colonel and a strange report from some lookouts. We had assembled my unit, what was left of it, and we were about 20 in all. We had some new blood come in, raw recruits, most of them, but there was talk that they meant to send us to the front line. They were starting to push back against the Nazis, and they needed just about every hand to make it happen. The problem was that we weren't in Alaska to stop the Germans. We were in Alaska to stop the Russians. The United States military had decided that Russia might decide to swoop in after the war and take back the rich oil deposits in Alaska, or that the Japanese would come in and beat them to it if the war went south for us. They also had some suspicions that the native population were working with the Russians and meant to turn on us. It was all malarkey, though. John said there were a lot of stories about how the Ruskies were worse than we were to the natives, and that any notion that they would welcome them back was preposterous. The fact of the matter is, the Russians subjugated us harshly, splitting up families and using children and wives as leverage against tribal attacks. The United States hasn't treated us much better in the past, but currently we're mostly ignored and tolerated. This is considered progress. It didn't sound so great to me, and he said it with a sad smile that let me know he was practicing his gallows humor. Anyway, I've gone off trail. The reason for the meeting was some of our lookouts had seen something strange on a nearby island, a little patch of land called Kepchki. Now, Kepchki was little more than 20 miles from the center in all directions. They had a little population of elk and lots of native birds nested there in the warm months. The fishing around the island was supposed to be particularly choice, but the natives did not, as a rule, go to the island. John wouldn't say why, but I suspected it had something to do with cultural superstition, like the woods near town. The island had trees on it, and fresh water, probably other resources, but the army was concerned that the Reds or the Japanese might be using it as a listening post. Our lookouts have seen what they might call people moving around on the island. Intel says it's nothing definitive, no confirmed sightings, but the lookout guys think it might be humanoid in appearance. Humanoid in appearance was something the lookouts used to describe a lot of stuff. Small bears, monkeys, hell, even large otters, so I've been told, have fallen under humanoid in appearance. It's ass-covering language, to be sure, but you get a glimpse of something, and it might be nothing, but in case it's something, you call it in anyway. The colonel was putting together a small team to go out and investigate, and I was selected for it. John was asked to go as well, the brass thinking his knowledge of the area might be useful, and they put about 6 of the recruits under us to back us up. John and I had a reputation for handling ourselves, and I think when we found those boys and brought John's nephew back from the woods, it went a long way to speaking for our character. So they piled 8 of us into a pontoon boat, and away we went for Kepchki. The waters were pretty fair that day, and as we rowed, I asked John why his people didn't take advantage of the island's resources. A place like that in Appalachia would have been hunted, clear-cut, and settled for sure. John looked like he didn't want to say, but he trusted me and finally came out with it. Legend says that the island is home to the Rinrat, he finally said, keeping his voice low. He had to repeat it for me a couple of times, and I told him it was a bit of a mouthful. They're little people, not of our world, but similar. They're said to be able to step in and out of our world, and they like to hunt and gather as we do. They had been sighted on the island before, but they don't like to be disturbed. If we see them, we should leave. They aren't hostile, but they don't like being disturbed, and they can turn violent. We have something similar back home. Grandma always told me not to encroach on fairyland, and your Ringrat sound a lot like them. We came to the shore then, and as we stepped off, I left for them to make camp as we slunk into the bush. The trees were little more like the firs I had back home, and the ground was carpeted with needles and limbs. The ground was stony, but the soil was rich and brown. It felt moist as I took a handful of it to test, and I figured there might be bushes that had nuts or fruit somewhere on the island too. It was good soil, and it must have taken a lot of fear to keep the natives from it. We had walked a short way in before I discovered that we weren't the island's first explorers. We were moving slowly, keeping an eye on our surroundings, when John tapped my shoulder and pointed off to the left. "Tent," he whispered, and as I squinted, I did see something that looked like a tent pole jutting up near us. I got the boys in order, and we crunched as quietly as we could towards the potential enemy camp. Well, they were potential enemies, but I doubt they'd be raising many alarms when we happened upon them. We came on a few tents, the poles the only thing left behind, but some fur scraps. No canvas on these puppies, and the metal poles were old and less uniform than the ones the army gave us. Sitting around the remains of what could charitably still be called a fire pit were 3 skeletons, picked clean and grinning. There was a lonely food tin sitting next to 'em, and one had a bottle clutched in his bony fingers as if he needed only to lift it to his disappeared lips. All of 'em grinned merrily as if to invite us to the party, and it was a sobering sight. We checked around, but there was very little to be found. The tin was free of labels or legends, and the bottle was brown like a medicine glass, but bore no signs. The skeletons wore scraps of clothes they had died in, but time had almost eaten these away as well. The tent was no help either. The furs had dissolved, and the metal was just crude poles. They could be American or Russians or Martians for all we knew. It seemed like the cold had killed them, but as the 2 recruits moved off, John pointed to the ribs of the one holding the bottle. They were chipped, as if something had pierced between 2 of them. A knife, maybe, I suggested, but John only shrugged. We hit the other side of the island about an hour later, but we wouldn't see anything else until our trip back. We had decided to crisscross the island during the day, not really keen on staying the night after finding the old campsite. We would eat dinner and pack up at sunset, hopefully marching back to the barracks by nightfall. We were coming back towards the boat, maybe 20 minutes from where we had left the others, when we heard something. It was a perfect baritone, sounding like someone singing from the bottom of a well. I called for a stop, and we all got low as I pulled out my binoculars and started looking for the source of the singing. I found it picking up sticks near the juncture of 2 firs, and it was an odd little creature, to be sure. It was a perfectly normal human, though shrunk to the size of a toddler. I don't mean it was a little person, though that's the closest I can come to describing it. It had a long beard and a thick set of eyebrows. It appeared hairy, though that could have been furs too. There was something on its belt, a knife or a small axe, and it rolled along comfortably as it collected wood. This was a normal day for the creature, something it had done 1,000 times before, and it was no more wary of its surroundings than I would have been in my own woods. The song it sang was deep and old as the hills. Its voice lacked nothing so much as rocks rolling down a mountain. I prepared to tell the boys that we would be going around when the crash of a rifle drowned out John's warning. One of the recruits, Gibbs, I think his name was, had seen it too as he peeked through his rifle scope. He had seen it and probably jumped to the conclusion that it was an enemy. There was a lot of hurtful propaganda about those of Asian descent at the time. This kid probably thought he had stumbled on a Japanese spy. John had seen him a moment too late. His own binoculars trained on the thing, and his shout hadn't come in time. The bullet hit the creature, but it was like shooting a brick wall with a pea shooter. It stumbled, never really losing its footing, and when it turned to look at our position, I knew we were in trouble. It seemed to fall into itself, its body pulling into a stormy hole that it drug close behind it, and I yelled for the rest to run. We took off through the firs, but we were not alone. Gibbs and the other one, I forget his name, were not as adept in the woods as John and I, and it showed. They tripped and stumbled over roots that we missed easily, and when Gibbs cried out in pain, I reached back to catch him. The kid thought he'd twisted his ankle, but I saw the source of his problem. A little arrow was sticking out of his lower leg, and as I offered him a shoulder, I reached down and broke it off. The woods were suddenly full of grunts and growls, little projectiles flying in to stab and prod as we ran for it. He likely hadn't hurt the creature, but it was mad now, and mad goes a long way. John called out, letting us know the beach wasn't very far, and we ran for our lives as the brush crackled under our feet. They had to be at least a dozen, and I could see furry bodies and hairy creatures as they moved about. They gnashed their teeth too big for their childish faces, and I knew now what had stripped those bodies in the clearing. They may not be violent, but scavengers will scavenge, won't they? I tossed a prayer to the man upstairs, hoping for a little luck, and as we came out of the trees, I sighed in relief. We probably looked like explorers at the end of a native film, and the irony of that statement isn't lost on me. We scared the hell out of those kids we'd left at camp, and they looked confused when I told them to get to the boats. They wanted to pack the gear, to grab the supplies, but I told them to grab their rifles and leave everything else. One of them ended up in the boat without his boots, another one leaving his coat behind, but as we shoved off into the water, I expected that the arrows would follow us on our way. Nothing came to the shore, however. Nothing followed us into the water, and as we floated out into the bay, the others asked what had happened. Before Gibbs could start in, I overrode him. We ran up on some polar bear cubs, and the mother wasn't far behind. We barely made it out alive, and it's a wonder that she didn't chase us into the bay. Gibbs gave me a look, but my look was stonier. It told him flatly not to press it, and just to learn that sometimes caution is best. We went back and told the brass about what had happened, and they figured that the bears were what had been seen. The lookouts didn't see anything on the island after that, other than our gear, which they sent a unit back to get later. Gibbs never talked, thankfully, and John and I agreed to never speak of what we had seen there. The old stories were right, and the island was the property of the Erankrat. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but that was when I heard the snap of the trap from the shed. Grandpa and I set out, flashlights bobbing, and found a very angry fox sitting in the cage as he yelped and begged to be let out, in his high and unknowable voice. Grandpa chuckled. Sometimes, though, it's just a crafty fox with too much curiosity for his own good. We'll get Glimmer to set him loose somewhere far from here. No sense killing him for being smart and hungry. We let him stew for the night, Grandpa yawning as he returned to the kitchen table. I stayed in Alaska for quite a while, but the war couldn't last forever. Maybe next time I'll tell you about its end and how I ended up staying in Alaska for longer than I meant to. Grandpa's yawn was contagious, and I told him that it sounded like a plan after a big yawn of my own. With the mystery of our food thief solved, it was time for some much-deserved rest. I hadn't wanted to go to Applebee's, but my friends insisted. I'm not opposed to going out for a meal, but I hate going to Applebee's in our town. It's a gathering place for every half-drunk Chad and happy-hour drunk who doesn't have enough money to drink at the yacht club, but has too much class to go to the Tilted Stool. We aren't big drinkers. I mean, we like to tie on a few sometimes, but these guys get downright sloppy. We get a booth as far from the bar as we can, and it's still so damn noisy in there. By the end of the night, we're all yelling at each other just to be heard over the jukebox or the drunks. I spend the rest of the night with my eardrums pounding and my head ready to crack open. At least that's how it's always been until tonight. So, we're in the back booth, like always, when I see the guy. Mark was talking about some girl he was seeing from work, Frank laughing like a donkey. His latest drink bounced around, threatening to spill as he pounded the table, and I looked up from my cowboy burger, just in time to see this guy hunkered over his food at the end of the row. He was bent over his plate, top of his bald head gleaming, and the light overhead lit him like a wax sculpture. I'm not usually one for people watching, but this guy kind of stood out. He reminded me of a story from Temple, back when I still went with my parents. They told us a story about a guy who'd built a creature to get revenge, a golem, and that was my first thought when I saw this guy. That sounds a little harsh, but I only mean he appeared not like a man, more like the approximation of a man. He had a white button-up, a red tie hanging loose around his neck, and even from here I could see the sweat starting to pool under his arms. Despite the noise, I could hear him almost perfectly, too. At first, I thought he was eating his meal real loudly, bent over at the waist like a dog. But the longer I watched, the more I thought he might be crying. His shoulders were hitching in slow up and down jerks, and he appeared to be sobbing into his plate. I felt a little voyeuristic as I watched him. Poor guy was probably living what was the worst day of his life. He'd probably been stood up for a date or lost his mom, and here I was just watching. When Mark nearly leaned into my ear, I jumped a little when he spoke. "What you looking at, Pally?" He followed my line of sight and found the poor guy before I could. Whew! That's a guy who's got a date with a rope later. Frank turned to look, but winced as Mark kicked him. "Don't look! Ain't you got no sense?" Poor fella. Kinda looks like this guy that came into the gas station the other night. He comes in high as a kite, and when I wouldn't sell him beer, he just starts crying, and Mark went on, but I wasn't really paying any attention anymore. I felt a little bad for continuing to watch him, but I just couldn't turn away. Something about him was mesmerizing. It was like driving past a car crash and being unable to stop staring at the bodies on the pavement. You know it's wrong to stare, but you just can't stop. Frank was braying laughter again, and I could see our waitress contemplating whether to cut him off or not as she came to get our plates. Mark told her he was fine, and Frank ordered another beer. And after several tense seconds and an elbow from Mark, I snapped back to myself and said I was okay too. "Geez, buddy," Mark said as the waitress shuffled off. "You gonna go over and propose?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, biting into my burger and realizing it was about lukewarm. Had I really been staring at that poor guy as my burger turned to ice? You've been staring at him for like 10 minutes. Thought you were going to order him a drink for a minute." We all laughed, mine being a little forced, and then Mark stood up and waved to a pair coming through the door. Jim and his wife Celine waved at us in turn, and Frank moved our side of the table so the two lovebirds could sit together. They had been inseparable since college, and I don't think I'd ever seen one without the other more than a handful of times. They excused their lateness, their sitter had been late, and Jim started in on a story about how she had gotten lost and turned down the wrong road, when I turned my attention back to the poor guy 2 booths down. He was still bent over his burger, still quietly sobbing, but the way his shoulders moved had started to seem wrong. I was no expert on sobbing, but this guy's herky-jerky movements were starting to look like something else. A rational part of me chastised myself for continuing to stare at this poor guy, but it was like a moth to flame now. He was my car wreck, and I was starting to notice signs of foul play. When he snorted loudly, I heard the laughter for the first time. It made me shiver a little as I heard it thrum into me like a badly played piano note. The guy wasn't crying. He was laughing. The more I looked, the more I could see bits of meat and lettuce sprayed over the tabletop. The longer I looked, the more I wondered how I'd misunderstood his laughter for crying. I was now drawn deeper into this web of strangeness. No escape in sight. Crying was one thing. I could understand crying, but who sits in a booth by themselves and laughs? Was he nuts? Some kind of mental case who was off his meds? Watching him from behind Selena's shoulder, I wondered if he might be dangerous. Maybe we should leave. Maybe I should suggest that we change venues, but all thought of escaping fled from me as he lifted his head from that plate. The scream that welled up inside me was cut off by my constricted throat and likely sounded like nothing so much as a sigh. The man's face looked like a fantastic bit of prosthesis. It was like a piece of Halloween decoration that's just a little too realistic. The kind you worry might contain a person who wants to bite. His face looked like the front of a thumb, calloused and rippled with wrinkles or ridges. His eyes were like colorless slits, something slashed into his face with a knife. His nose appeared to be drawn on, like a cartoon character's. He was unreal, something that shouldn't exist in polite society outside of a circus tent. His mouth, though, his mouth was the worst. His mouth was full of long, needle-like teeth, reminding me of an anglerfish as it protruded from his thin lips. Those teeth looked like they would never close comfortably. From here, it looked like they would constantly poke at your lips and gums, and you would be in agony most of the time. There were pieces of meat on those teeth, red raw chunks that had been speared by them, and that's when I looked down at the plate. It was covered in the grisly remains of what looked like chunks of raw hamburger meat. I doubted like hell that the staff had just handed this guy raw beef, but the alternative seemed even wilder. The alternative was that this man had brought his own raw meat from home so he could just consume it here in public. As the horror ran through me like ice water, I looked up to see those colorless slits observing me. The two of us just stared at each other for a count of 5. Then he pulled those thin lips and monstrous teeth into a smile, and I could see red pooling at the edges of his flesh. I glanced over at Mark and Frank, both now sitting on my side of the booth, but neither of them had noticed him. The 4 of them were involved in a conversation like there wasn't a monster sitting 12 feet from us. It seemed impossible that anyone could be having a normal conversation so close to that creature. Its very presence should have triggered some ancient primal node deep in our brains and forced us to either destroy it or flee from it. The four of them were talking about jobs and school and Jim and Celine's daughter, while this thing got to exist in humanity with the rest of us. It was too much to handle. Suddenly I wanted out. I wanted to be anywhere but there. I tried to tap on Mark to get him to move or to look up or just acknowledge that I was losing my mind within easy reach of him. But my body wouldn't respond. I managed to flick my fingers at his arm, bumping him a little, but he only rubbed a hand over it as if a bug had landed on him. Celine was talking about the new Pokemon game, and Mark and Frank were just nerdy enough and broke enough to be enraptured by her descriptions. I was stuck in a state of eye contact with that thing, and the longer I looked, the more it seemed to drink me in with those strange eyes. Then, without warning, it began to sink down in its seat, becoming lost beneath its table. I panicked. Suddenly not being able to see it was worse than having it on display. Could it sink beneath our table? How far could it go? How close could it get? I was suddenly imagining the damage those teeth could do to a foot, even a foot within a shoe, and I pulled mine up a little higher as Selena's words washed over me. He didn't resurface for quite some time, and you would have said that such a thing would not have gone unnoticed. Then he slid back up from under the table on the opposite side of the booth. He was grinning from ghastly ear to ear, and he looked like a little kid who's trying to play with the table behind them. There was still a table between us and him, but I was no longer sure how much protection that provided us. I didn't know his mental state, and whether he meant to do us harm or not, but when he dipped back down again, I started shaking. "What's wrong with you?" Mark asked suddenly, turning to look at me as I shuddered beside him. I pointed to the empty plate where the man had been sitting, and Mark looked over before scoffing loudly. "Oh no, your boyfriend left. Don't worry, I'm sure most of those guys at the bar will take you home if you ask them nicely enough." "What's going on?" Jim asked, noticing my discomfort and looking alarmed. "He's obsessed with the guy that's sitting a couple of tables back. Couldn't take his eyes off of him, I swear. Thought he was gonna try to console the guy for a minute. Dude was just sitting there crying, and this freak's over here looking at..." The bald, sweaty head began to surface behind Selena, and when I shouted for her to look out, the whole restaurant went dead silent. Jim and Selena turned to look, but there was nothing behind them. I'd had enough, though. I pushed Mark and Frank out of the way, freeing myself from the booth as I went to go check under the table behind us. He'd be crouching down there, grinning like the little goblin that he was. But as I got down on my knees and looked beneath, I was greeted by nothing but an empty space. The waitress asked me what I was looking for as I moved to look under his table as well, but by then I was already intent on leaving. I got in my car, threw the keys in the ignition, and sped off as fast as I could. Sitting at home now, I can't get that image out of my head. My phone's been blowing up, and I know my friends are worried. I can't make sense of it. What was that thing? Why did it take such an interest in me? Is it dangerous? Did it follow me home? Every time I close my eyes, I see those repulsive needle-like teeth and the no-color slits looking back at me. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything but that creature again. Crystal stepped out of the car and walked up the steps of her home in West L.A. It had been a good funeral. Lots of people there to see her being sad and see her paying her respects, to a man who had made her career. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, Jarrett had been the best thing to happen to her in years. She'd been a rising star. She'd ridden him to heaven so that she could watch him fall. It was cold, but hey, it was showbiz. She felt her phone rattle inside her purse and remembered that she had set a reminder for tonight. She had spent too much time out mourning with the other beautiful people and had almost forgotten her promise to her public. Jarrett's video, biography, and anything else that dealt with her life was trending high today. And Jarrett, it seemed, had left her one last boost in popularity before he stepped out. She set the scene before she went live. She poured herself a fashionable drink, slipped into something a little less depressing, and found a place to lounge. This could be her last chance to cash in on her ex-boyfriend, and she meant to monopolize it to the fullest. Jarrett's star might have fallen, but her own could still rise higher. Who knew? This video might even change the world. She flounced her hair a little, trying for that crossroads of casual and effortlessly hot, and pressed live on her laptop. Good evening, everyone. As you all know, Jarrett's funeral was today. I've cried for him since I got up this morning, and I can't think of anything more fitting to honor his memory than to play the last song he ever sang. She reached up and smudged her mascara a little. Raccoon eyes always played well for the camera. Let me play you the message that he left again, in case any of you missed it yesterday. That was crap, of course. No one had missed his message last night. She could already see the eyes on her, and 20,000 people were watching already. All of them had liked and shared last night's broadcast. She was sure of it. Now they were all coming back for the money shot, and she wasn't about to let them down. She pulled out her phone and pressed play as she held it close to the screen. Jarrett's voice poured through the speakers, and she had to stop herself from shuddering when she heard it. The Jarrett she knew had never yelled, never really raised his voice to her, and certainly never raised a hand to her. He was a nice guy, and there had been times that she had felt a little bad about the things she accused him of. Even when they fought, he never put his hands on her, or let his voice rise higher than a monotone. It was how his mother had taught him to be, and he had never forgotten how a man should treat a lady. This Jarrett, however, wasn't the one she had known. He sounded wrong. He sounded cruel. This Jarrett sounded like he might hit her, sounded like he might scream in her face, and sounded like he might enjoy killing her for no better reason than she deserved it. She had watched him after his fall, watched the sad Jarrett who made depressing ballads and soft emo music. That Jarrett had been hard to watch. This Jarrett was something else. This Jarrett was the one who would have done the things that she'd accused him of doing. Hello, Chris. I guess you're too busy to talk to me, so just listen. I've written you a song. Remember when I used to do that? It's just for you, so make sure you don't share it with anybody else. Something you can remember me by after I'm gone. As the message ended, she composed her face and went on. I guess he never quite got over me. The time of death on his police report was minutes after this message ended. It's kind of sweet that his last thoughts were of me. I haven't listened to the song yet. I thought I'd share it with all of you on the eve of his funeral. Let's send his soul off with one last happy tribute. This one's for you, Jarrett. I hope you've found peace wherever you are. She pressed play on the next message, and the song started almost at once. It was sung a cappella, and she was surprised that he hadn't used any instruments. His last song, Birds of Paradise, had been sad and depressing, but this song was clearly something darker, something more personal. It was about her. Of that, she was sure. It was full of angry discourse and jagged discords. This new Jarrett wasn't holding anything back, had nothing to hold back, and the song was an angry dirge that scraped across her nerves. It almost seemed like in the background, someone was laughing too. If she listened closely, She could hear canned animatronic laughter that cut through Jarrett's pseudo-screamo. The song lasted about 3 minutes, and when the line finally went dead, Crystal was glad for it. The tears that streamed down her face now were real, and she could see from the comments that she wasn't the only one crying. She composed herself and tried to end this video without sounding as uncomfortable as she felt. Now that it was over, she wished that no one else had heard it. It had been so personal. It had been Jarrett airing their dirty laundry, and she felt embarrassed to have others hear it. He had talked about so many things she hadn't known he had known, and things that might look bad on her if he brought them to light. She would have to do a little damage control now. She would have to wait for the fires to spring up. She rubbed her eyes again and found them wet. I hate that things had to end this way. Despite how he treated me, Jarrett was my best friend once. I thought, not too long ago, about being with him for the rest of my life. I imagined us having kids, singing on stage together, growing old together, living out our golden years in each other's arms. I hate that this is how it had to end. I hate that I couldn't have been there to stop him from taking his own life. I hate that... She thought for a moment that something moved in the corner. She looked over quickly, afraid that maybe some fan had come in to crash her live stream. But it was just the thick curtains over the bay window. I hate that we couldn't make things work. If you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, I'll link the suicide prevention hotline below. Don't let someone else end like this. Jarrett was too talented to... She heard a rasp of something directly on her left, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. What the hell had that been? She lost her train of thought, but she hoped it would come off as her being distraught over the song. To end up like this. Get help before it's too late. I'm gonna go. I need to be alone after all this. But I hope that you have a good evening, and remember to be good to each other. She signed off. When she was sure that the camera was dead, she called Ronaldo at the front gate. Yes, Miss Maldonado. Ronaldo, there's something in my house. I'm going upstairs to take a long bath, and I want you and your men to comb through the house and find out what it is. Do you suspect that it's a person or an animal? Or I suspect that I pay you way too much to ask stupid questions. Get in here, search the house, and find whatever it is. She hung up on him and went upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The tub was massive, big enough for 3 in fact, and it was part of the reason that Crystal had bought the house. She loved nothing so much as soaking in her tub and letting the world float by. She could hear Ronaldo moving around downstairs as she stripped off her clothes and let a heady sigh escape her as she sank into the warm water. She put her hair in a long tail and let it hang over the edge as she let the heat settle on her skin and pushed the button for the jets. Crystal had a long day of schmoozing and networking, topped off by a terrible song from Jarrett, and now she wanted to relax. When the chuckle crawled into her ears, she rolled over in the water and stared around the bathroom. The jets were like mini airplane engines in her ears, and there should have been no way that she could hear anything. She looked over the small room before sinking back into the warm water. She let her mind relax, her body floating beneath the surface, as the soothing jets massaged her back and arms, ridding her body of the tension she had carried all. When someone grabbed and yanked her ponytail, she spun around and put her back to the opposite wall of the garden tub. Her eyes moved like a trapped animal's, but she saw nothing. She turned off the jets and toweled off. She suddenly didn't feel like relaxing anymore. She was in bed an hour later when the shadows began to gather. She had Ronaldo search the whole house twice, but neither he nor his security men found anything. She sat in her bed the whole time, blankets pulled up to her chin, as they moved about her room, her bathroom, her closets, and checked every room upstairs and downstairs. The sun was setting when Ronaldo came back to report, but his news was far from satisfactory. They'd found nothing, less than nothing. They'd found no means of entry, forced or otherwise, and except for her coming in with the keys earlier, no one had been in or out of the house since she'd left for the funeral. The cameras and sensors had found nothing. She was alone, as far as anyone knew. That's impossible. Someone pulled my ponytail. Now either it was you or one of your security guys playing a joke. Either way, I don't appreciate it. Ronaldo looked apprehensive for a moment before saying what was on his mind. Are you sure that maybe you didn't just get it hung on something? Crystal narrowed her eyes at him. Are you asking me if I know the difference between having my hair pulled and getting it tangled on something? No, ma'am, but you have seemed to be under some stress lately. Maybe you're just jumping at shadows, being paranoid. Is that what you think, Ronaldo? He shrugged. There's no one in your house, ma'am. We're sure of it. She waved a hand at him. Then you can go. You can all go. Ronaldo raised an eyebrow. You don't want a night detail left behind? Did I stutter? Go! Since you all think I'm going nuts, I wouldn't expect any of you to stay behind and have me waste your time. Get out of here. I don't need your services tonight. Maybe not ever again. Ronaldo looked disappointed, but he did as he was told. When the door closed behind him, she wished he had stayed. The house seemed very quiet now that they were gone, and she hunkered under the covers like a child as she tried to sleep. Maybe he was right. Perhaps all she needed to alleviate some of this stress was a good night's sleep. She was on the cusp of something great. She could feel it, and she couldn't afford to let the stress get to her now. As she felt her eyes getting heavy, though, she could hear Jarrett's last song, and it let her down into a dream of him. She sat in a small coffee shop, sitting alone in a dark room full of murmurs. The other tables were cast in pale circles of gloom, but beyond them was a darker area that she didn't like to think about. It almost seemed to move if she gazed at it, and it made her very uncomfortable. Things were watching her from that darkness, and they didn't like her at all. The stage lights came on then, and there was Jarrett. He was sitting on the stage with an old acoustic guitar that his granddad had given him, strumming away and humming to himself. She never understood what he saw in that battered old thing, but she had never had any grandparents to give her a guitar, so maybe it was beyond her understanding. She had tried to get rid of it more than once. He had so many expensive guitars to play, but he always refused. Sometimes she'd catch him on the porch, strumming away and looking wistful. Today, though, he was singing the song he had sung on her voicemail, and the guitar was playing something she had never heard before. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anything. As he sang, the song went on, and she began to hear things. She heard a rustle, a dry, skeletal rattling that seemed to come from the deeper darkness beyond her. The quiet rustling became laughter, like the laughter at the edges of his last song, and she began to see things appear at the tables around her. Hunched, dark little things that watched Jarrett and rattled that hollow laughter like a can full of bones or a bottle full of dead leaves. The more that appeared, the more that laughed, the laughter sounding fake, robotic, the laughter of a sitcom, and the volume seemed to rise as the tables started to fill. Jarrett played on, oblivious, calling them there as he poured out his heart, and they clustered around the edges of the stage. She was The only person here other than him, and she felt vulnerable in that sea of inky monsters. When they all turned their smiling faces to her, eyeless faces seeming to notice her for the first time, she woke up screaming. She twisted in the grip of the bedclothes, the comforter and sheets having tangled her as she thrashed around. And when she came to, she felt them grip her, and her panic became real. She could feel their hands on her, holding her down, trying to bite her with those two big teeth. There had been dozens, maybe hundreds of them, and now that they had seen her, she was sure that they would want to get her for what she had done. When she opened her eyes, though, she was alone. She untangled herself from the covers and couldn't help but laugh at her silliness. What was she doing? She'd gotten so worked up over a stupid dream. The song had gotten to her, and now she was projecting onto her dreams. Jarrett's song had been terrible to hear, but it was just a song. It couldn't get her, or hurt her, or do anything. Her door creaked open then, a skeletal chuckle sliding up from the hallway. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't quite find the breath. When whatever it was didn't immediately come in and get her, she decided to go have a look. She turned on Facebook and began a live stream. "Hey guys, it's me. I think someone's in my house. I'm hearing a lot of weird noises." She was in the hall outside her bedroom, sneaking around like a prowler in her own home. As she moved the flashlight on her phone from side to side, there was nothing there. The door to the other two upstairs rooms were closed, the stairs bare, and she could see no one in the hall. She could see the names on the screen, people commenting that it looked spooky, trying to see if she was okay. But they seemed to be her only company. No one out here could be seen, and she was ready to turn back when the door to her studio creaked open, and she jumped back a little. "There, did you see that?" she asked, but realized quickly that the camera had been facing the wrong direction. Some of her viewers claimed that this was fake, but many of them were telling her to call the police and get someone out there. She approached the door instead, wanting to see what was in there. As she approached, she heard music coming just beyond the door. The studio housed her instruments, guitars, a drum set, keyboards, various recording equipment. She often went in there to strum out a tune or jot down a song, but most of the stuff was just there for show. It was expected that a songwriter would have these things, so she did. Her chord work was sloppy at best. Jarrett had always been the gifted musician, but she still put down some lyrics now and again, and cobbled together something for a collab with this artist or that artist. Usually these lyrics came from the green binder she had stolen out of Jarrett's desk before she left his house, but no one needed to know about that. She creaked the door open, spilling the hallway light's murky glow into the room. Her hand scrambled across the wall for the light switch, but froze as the phantom chords twanged out again. She heard a snippet of her own song, sung in a familiar voice that came wafting from the corner. She glanced over and found someone sitting on her $1,500 drum set, holding her $3,000 Les Paul, crooning her own tunes back to her in what was a distinctly sardonic way. She started to shout, her hands finding the switch, but before the lights came on, she saw the musician look up and smile at her in an unsettling way. Right before the lights came on, she could swear she was seeing Jarrett there in the same suit that he had been buried in. Then the lights snapped on, and she was looking at an empty drum set, her guitar leaned against it, and an unpleasant odor still hanging on the air. "Did you see that?" she asked the viewers, her voice little more than a whisper. Did Did any of you see that? There were many question marks and asking if she was on drugs or something, and she huffed at them. That man in the corner playing the guitar, did none of you see him? She didn't dare claim it was Jarrett. If he was fresh in the ground and she was already claiming to be haunted by him, people would crucify her. Most of the comments indicated that they thought she needed to get some sleep. The ones that didn't state outright that they didn't believe her, and she saw that she would get no help on this front. She signed off and left the studio, taking one more look before she left. But she knew what she had seen. Ronaldo commented the next day that she looked tired. And you look like a guy who spends his paycheck on steroids and blow, but I'm too much of a lady to mention something like that, Crystal snapped back at him over her second Bloody Mary. Her chef had laid out quite the breakfast spread. Fruit, an omelet, toast, juice, but she had no appetite for any of it. She had dozed off a few times last night, but always seemed to be awakened by that incessant chuckling. Her house seemed to be haunted by it, and it kept her awake all night. When she had finally risen around 4, she had started drinking and had yet to stop. She had taken down the Facebook Live video, but people were still talking about it. They had all seen her blundering through her house, drunk or high, and talking about things that no one could see. It seemed to have created a divide in her fans overnight, and more of them seemed to think that she was high or just shitposting for attention. The rest thought that she was stressed, under a lot of pressure right now, and maybe losing her cool. Whatever it was, no one had seen what she had seen. She lay around most of the day, going from the pool to the living room to the kitchen to her bedroom, and always she felt hounded by the soft chuckles that wafted through the air. She couldn't escape them, and as the day stretched on, nowhere felt safe from the scampering shadows that came along with her. She would see them out of the corner of her eye, see them loping just outside her vision. They haunted her. Ronaldo finally leaving altogether after she called him to check the house for the 5th time. She'd been in her bedroom, drowsing in bed, when the door had creaked open like it had last night, and she had heard the skeletal chuckle as it raked across her consciousness. Ronaldo had crossed his arms and scowled when she'd ordered him to search the house again. No. She stared at him, shocked. Excuse me? You heard me. I said no. My men have searched this house, basement to attic, 4 times today. Hell, half of them have already walked off, and I don't have the heart to fire them. I'm done, Crystal. I don't know what game this is, or what new drug you're on, but I'm done with this bullshit. Find someone else to keep you safe, 'cause I'm out of here. She screamed at him, railed at him, told him she would ruin him, but he and his men had left, leaving her alone with the chef and the housekeeper and the driver and the haunting creatures that constantly laughed at her. I know I'm not crazy. She was walking to the kitchen as the sun cast its last light over the horizon when the bathroom door opened and she heard that chuckling coming from inside. The water came on as well, the tub, she thought, and she stood transfixed by the sight of the open door as it seemed to leak darkness into the hallway. She was frozen, unsure how to proceed. So she did the only thing that had ever gotten her through this sort of stuff. She opened Snapchat and started talking to her fans. This weirdness just keeps happening. The bathroom door just popped open. The water started flowing, and I'm scared, guys. Her chat log began to flood with messages, but she held the camera out, the light illuminating the dark bathroom as she came forward. The water was still running, the tub filling somehow, as she shakily walked inside. She found the switch and flipped it, the light not coming on, despite how many times she flicked it on and off. The water in the tub looked black, but that could have just been the room's lack of light. Then the surface burst, and Jarrett came out, his wrists trailing blood. "You're really losing it, Chris. Sounds like you might be ready for the funny farm." She could see him sitting there in the bathtub, his grinning face looking cold as the phone light illuminated him. But her screen, as she peeked at it to make sure that he was in frame, showed nothing. On the screen, the tub was empty. On the screen, the tub contained nothing but the glare from the light. On the screen, the taps did nothing but gleam chromely. In the tub, however, Jarrett was writing "Crystal is a bitch" on the wall of the tub in his own blood. "Why are you here? What do you want?" she almost screamed. "You took my life, Chris, so I'm here to return the favor." "Sweet dreams," he said, waving as black hands drug him into the bathtub. She screamed as the light came on and fell backwards into the hallway, her fingers coming off the button. The whole exchange had taken less than a minute. She sat trembling on the floor as the messages came rolling in. Most of them thought she was faking it. The rest questioned whether she'd had a mental breakdown. No one believed her. She looked back on the events of the night before and felt that her life was becoming unraveled. She'd spent another sleepless night wandering through her house. The laughing voices had dogged her heels, the little shadow people running in and out of her peripheral vision. And she had posted video after video to Snapchat and Facebook of her screaming at nothing or hiding from the pursuers that only she could see. They had opened any door that she closed, invaded any space that she had hoped would give her refuge, and because of them, the cook had now left as well. Well, that had been her too, she guessed. She'd been hiding in the pantry when he'd come in to work that morning. She was crying, begging the creatures to leave her alone, and when he'd opened the door, she'd panicked. She'd thrown cans at him, screaming like a banshee as she drove him out of the pantry door. He had left in a huff, saying that he couldn't deal with this sort of behavior. The driver had pulled up about that time, and he had gotten into his car and pulled away as well. When the maid hadn't shown up by noon, Crystal assumed that she was alone now, alone with her demons. They hounded her again as she walked through the house. She moved like a sleepwalker, shooting videos sometimes, but mostly just walking around and trying to get away, trying to find someplace they couldn't find her. She would make updates to Facebook, little segments for Snapchat, and her views were through the roof, but not because people liked what she was doing. Since yesterday, she had gained 5,000 new followers, but all of them just seemed to be there to watch her fall apart. They laughed at her, they mocked her, and said this was all a stunt. No one, however, tried to help her. Those fans that she had left had gone silent, and what remained just wanted to watch her fizzle out. She continued to wander around the house, her whole day kind of blurring by as she ran from the laughter. At one point she was in the hallway, a knife in her hand, as she shouted into the dark corners. That's where they lived. That's where they hid. And she could see their eyeless, leering mouths now as she fell into a sleep-starved insanity. However, she dropped the knife when several of them dropped out of that dark corner, and her tired legs took her up the stairs and into her bedroom. She shot a video from the floor of her closet, hearing them caper outside as she sobbed and begged for someone to help her. The comments were mixed, most of them thinking this was an act, and others telling her to go confront them. She could see them under the door, though, and there were too many of them. She didn't dare go out there. She tried to show them to the people on her Facebook feed, but they either said they couldn't see anything, or just pretended to see them, so they could feed her delusion. She passed out after a couple of hours and found herself in the bathroom, her house dark as the sun went down. The whole day was gone, and she was looking into the cabinet over the sink and staring at the bottle of Percocet. She'd gotten them from somewhere. People were always giving her drugs or leaving them behind. She reached out for them, not knowing what she meant to do with them, but hoping that maybe they could help her somehow. They could make the fear go away, make her feel good, maybe even make her feel safe. She was so tired. That's a great idea, Chris. Just take the whole bottle and draw yourself a bath. Trust me when I say that drowning isn't nearly as bad as they make it out to be. Hopped up on all those perkies, you'll never even know you're— Shut up! She screamed, slamming the door on the medicine cabinet and watching the glass fall into shards in the sink. She turned and found him in the tub again. And why wouldn't he be? Why wouldn't she see him playing a guitar? Why wouldn't she see him sitting in her bathtub? He had lived for the guitar, and he had died in the bath after she had taken every bit of joy away from him. In a way, she guessed, she deserved this. She had ruined him, ruined this beautiful creature, and now she was paying the price. She reached out and took the bottle of pills and made her way to the bedroom. She sat on the bed, looking at them as the sun went down, finally unscrewing the top and taking a handful before walking to the door and opening it onto the balcony. The light came on as she balanced on the tip of the veranda. I found these pills in my medicine cabinet. They helped a little, but I can still hear his voice. He's telling me how this is my punishment, how I deserve to die. And you know what? He's right. I ruined Jarrett's career. He never hurt me. I just couldn't stand the idea that he would keep living and loving, being loved by the people after I left. I'm a heartless bitch, and I deserve this. She dropped the pills then, and as the video rolled, she jumped off the balcony. She hit the pool with a loud splash, and as she sank to the bottom, her last image of this world were the creatures coming to gather around the lip of the pool. She saw a larger one, too. She saw a man-shaped silhouette as it bent down to look at her. A hand broke the surface of the water, and she saw that he was reaching for her, saving her from the depths. She hesitated, fearing it was a trick, but finally grasped the hand in desperation, coughing and gasping as she broke the surface. She looked up, panting into the face of her savior. Jarrett smiled, but it was not the smile of the Jarrett she had known. "Glad you could join us, Chris. These guys said I needed a backup singer, and I told them I thought I knew someone who would work just fine." Crystal glanced back to the pool and saw her body still floating at the bottom. That would be where they found her when the paramedics finally believed the frantic callers. By then, though, it was far too late. The doctor, one of the newer plastic surgeons at Kashmir Hospital, looked a little sheepish as he approached my desk. I had only seen him a few times, and he had never spoken to me directly. He was a vain fella, in the same vein as a few of the other hotshot docs around the ER. But today, he looked rattled. His hair was unkempt, his clothes looked dirty, and he was glancing around in that way that made me think he might be followed. "Are you the one who collects the stories?" he asked. I looked around, not sure if he was hiding from someone, before telling him that I was. "Carl said you'd understand. I don't know what happened to me, but he told me that you might be able to help me make sense of it. I know you're at work, but do you have a minute to talk?" It was currently about 10 o'clock, and I was in the middle of a lull in activity. The real work wouldn't be possible until they called for visitors to leave, so I pushed out a chair and pulled out a notepad. I'd started carrying it religiously, the stories becoming habitual, and I wanted to get all the information while it was fresh. His name was Dr. Gary Long, and he'd experienced something that I had only heard about once before. The more he talked, the more I realized that he was talking about the creatures that had taken up residence in the forbidden corridor over the East Wing record mezzanine. I've only been working at Kashmir for a couple of months, but I'd heard all the rumors. Dr. Logan still tells people about what happened to him in the elevator. People talk about the ghost girl in the South Wing that jumps from the 5th-story balcony. And everyone, nurses and doctors alike, know that if you're in the OR too late, you might run into Shaky Leg Mary. I listened, but privately I thought they were nothing but stories. It was just talk. Every hospital has them, but Kashmir Hospital has a bit of a reputation. Even in med school, the students knew about the weirdness that surrounded the hospital, and when my friends heard I'd accepted a job offer there, they joked that I was going to get taken away by a ghost one night. Well, I don't think it was a ghost that tried to get me. Ghosts don't do what this thing did. It was late when I got done with my case. I dressed out and was leaving to get my car from the garage. This sounds silly, but I always park my car at the bottom of the parking lot. It's a 2021 Mercedes that I'm still likely going to be paying for when I'm 40, but doctors are expected to maintain a certain air of affluence. Fancy watches, big houses, shiny cars, it all gives off the illusion of wealth, while most of us are drowning in student loans or credit card debts. The car was a frivolity that I couldn't really afford, but I was trying and mostly succeeding at keeping my head above water. So when I took the elevator down to the 5th-floor basement of the car park and found nothing but empty spots, I was shocked. I had parked it in the 3rd spot on the left side, and now it was gone. There were no other cars down there either, so I could only assume that someone had either stolen it or it had been towed for some reason. I was grumbling when I climbed back into the elevator, but I felt confident that this could be solved in short order. If it had been stolen, then my insurance would get me a rental car and the police would find it. The car was insured for quite a lot, and I had little doubt that the premiums would buy me another one if it had been taken. If the hospital had my car towed, then they would get me a rental car and get the impound lot to bring my damn car back. When the elevator didn't move after I jabbed the buttons, my anger flared. I slapped at the buttons, but nothing happened. I picked up the phone and tried to call the switchboard, but there was no tone. The door didn't close either, which didn't seem weird until I thought about it. They just stayed open, and finally I threw the phone at the bank of lit-up buttons and decided to walk out of the garage and find someone to yell at. It had been a long day, and I was tired, and all this bullcrap was really starting to make me mad. I started walking towards the ramp then, and if I'd known what would happen later, I think I'd have just stayed in the elevator. The next floor up was empty too, and I wondered how late it was before my watch told me it was barely 9. Most of the other employees were probably just lazy and didn't want to drive all the way back up. They didn't care if people dinged their cars, and I figured I would see more cars as I went up. It was comfortable enough down here, the concrete box creating a cave of sorts, and the fluorescents overhead hummed with insectile good cheer. Other than the hum, my footfalls seemed to be the only noise. The constant tock, tock, tock of my sneakers was monotonous, but it was also a little nice to know that I hadn't just gone deaf. There really wasn't any other sound down there, and as I came to the 3rd floor, I was surprised that there still wasn't any windows to the outside. The first 2 levels had been basements, but surely this one should be at ground level, right? This floor was when I started to notice the plants as well. They were palmettos, I think, and they sprouted up from the concrete in places. The fronds looked pokey, and I really didn't want to touch them and find out. I wondered why maintenance or groundskeeping hadn't done something about them, but it was really none of my business. They were in the corners and out of the way, and they weren't hurting anything. The Georgia flora has always been a bit invasive sometimes, and seeing plants in a man-made structure wasn't anything uncommon. That was the first time I felt something watching me, too. I was coming up the ramp and onto the second floor when I heard something scrub against the concrete. It was a low sound, like fingernails, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The concrete parking structure was still empty, and it was becoming odd that I hadn't seen any cars or people. A dozen others, nurses and techs, had been with me in the surgery, and to see neither them or their vehicles here was strange. I was coming to the level just beneath the entrance ramp. Why hadn't I seen anyone yet? As the phantom eyes bored twin holes into my shoulder blades, I picked up the pace. I wanted to be out of here. My anger was beginning to subside as the creeping chill of fear sent icy fingers through it. The next floor should have definitely been at ground level, but it was the same bland box that the others had been. There were no cars, no people, but the plants had gotten thicker. They were looking more like jungle plants now, and the cool cave was becoming a little humid. I saw vines hanging from the ceiling, and they seemed to be coming right out of the concrete. Why hadn't I ever noticed any of this before? Its presence did little to soothe me, and when I heard a crunch from behind me, I quickened my pace. I could still hear that low noise coming from behind me. I wasn't as alone as I thought. It felt like something was stalking me, and as I ran up the next ramp, I almost cried out when it was more of the same. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream that we were trapped. The plants were becoming more dense, growing up out of the floor, and the concrete seemed to be giving way to dirt in places. I was running now, my feet carrying me onward as my brain began to scream at me that we were trapped. I stumbled, but I caught myself before I fell and glanced back to make sure that nothing was chasing me. I don't know how, but I knew that if I fell, that would be the end of me. I'd gone higher than the parking deck could possibly be, 5 floors higher than the roof, when the lights suddenly went out. I don't mean that the lights flickered. I don't mean they just sort of dimmed. I mean that suddenly I was something akin to blind. As I stood still in the blackness, I could hear them again. They sounded like animals, walking around on all fours as their claws scraped across the ground. I had thought there was only one of them, but the longer I listened, the more I thought it might be 2 or 3 or as many as 6. They were searching for me, stalking me through the murk, and I didn't dare move. Something in the instinctual part of my brain told me that if I moved, they'd know where I was. It told me to stand as still as I could and not to make a sound as they hunted for me. They searched, they sniffed, but eventually I heard them moving away, and that was when I made my escape. I ran like my life depended on it, and maybe it did. They heard me sooner than I would have thought, and tore off in my general direction. The layout of the parking structure was pretty uniform, and I knew that if I just kept moving in a circle, I could get to the next floor. Something in me screamed that if I could get out of here, that if I could get free of whatever loop I was in, that I could lose the creatures and be done with this madness. Their claws sounded huge as they ate up the ground. They made little huffing noises as they ran, and I couldn't imagine what they might look like. I think I settled on a pack of panthers that had come to get me, and when I suddenly ran into a concrete wall, I just knew they were about to rip me to shreds. It It turned out to be for the best, however. As I lay there trying to see if my nose was broken, something hit the wall I had run into with a sound that was loud and angry. It hit it hard enough to send concrete chips cascading over me, and I put a hand over my mouth as I lay completely silent on the dusty concrete. It picked itself up and shook off whatever damage the wall had done to it before snuffling the air soupily. It was looking for me, and I did not want to be found. I could feel its bulk as it came close, smell the rancid meat that must lay beneath those claws, and I hoped that it couldn't hear me trembling. Expected that every breath would be my last, and the thought that I would die as I took shallow half-breaths was depressing. Some indeterminate amount of time later, the creature moved away, and I got up as quietly as I could and tiptoed for the wall. I'd misjudged the circle I was making, and when I found the edge, I headed up the ramp and kept climbing. Something was different now. I could feel it, and when my light-deprived eyes began to adjust to the intrusion of light, I knew I was getting close to the surface. As my hopes came back, I started running again, and that's when I heard them behind me. I came up and saw the crossbar, a little booth that told me the front of the parking deck was in sight. I put on a burst of speed, and when I ducked under the arm, I heard something's claws rake across the wood. I fell onto the asphalt and looked back in time to see a solid black creature with a head like a spade. Its body looked like it was covered in scales instead of fur, and the teeth that hung from that mouth looked painfully big. It had no eyes, but it pointed its spade-shaped head in my direction and seemed to know where I was. Despite the small burn of the moon and the distant islands of the security lights, the creature was still unwilling to come out to get me. It slunk back into the parking structure, and I sighed in relief. I screamed in surprise when I heard footsteps coming towards me, but it was just Carl. He'd been smoking by the parking deck, and when he heard me running out, he came to investigate. I told him about the creature, and he only shrugged like this was just one more thing on this plate. He offered to go get my car for me, and when I asked him if he wasn't afraid of the things down there, he said it was nothing new. Stuff like this happens all the time, he said, and he told me to go wait for him in the front lobby. There's a guy there who I think will want to talk to you. I have a feeling he knows just about what you're talking about. The Mercedes in question came rolling up at that point, and Dr. Long seemed relieved. I finished my notes, but I could feel him staring in much the same way he had described the creature staring at him. So, have you ever heard of anything like this before? Yeah, it's not the first time. If it happens again, just stay in the elevator until it stops. The hospital is like a strange kind of waiting room all its own. Sometimes you slip into places that you aren't prepared for, and it's best to just wait until reality reasserts itself. I don't think I'll be in the parking structure again. I'll take my chances in staff parking. A few dings on the door is a small price to pay for peace of mind. He thanked me before leaving, and I transcribed his notes into the PDF I was keeping for weird things that happened around here. Eventually, we all slip into that strange other room just beyond the waiting room, and if you're lucky, you get to slip back out again too. Dr. Long was lucky, but he may not get lucky a second time.